Simone? Simone? She already knew.
The suitcase hit the bedroom floor with a sound too loud for the size of her hands. Simone Whitfield stood in the center of the master bedroom and looked at it. The suitcase was cream-colored and had been a wedding gift from her mother, Dorothy Barnes. It had a small monogram on the front, SWB Simone Whitfield Barnes. She had always used both names. Sterling thought it was charming. He called it old-fashioned. He said it in a way that was supposed to be a compliment. She opened it. The penthouse master bedroom was $3,000 a square foot, and every inch of it reflected Sterling Whitfield's taste, in the way that things reflect the taste of the person who wrote the check. The headboard was custom upholstered in champagne linen. The carpet was a shade of gray with a specific designer name she could never remember. The closet was his and hers with a glass divider between them, lit from underneath, the kind of lighting that made everything inside it look like it was on display in a store, something to admire and not quite touch. She went to her side. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She had expected her hands to shake. The baby moved. A slow roll, low and deliberate, the kind of movement that had started in the 7th month and had not stopped since. Simone pressed her palm flat against her left side for one moment. Just one. Then she reached for the first dress on the rod. The photograph had come at 2:47 in the afternoon. She knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock move from 2:46 to 2:47, wondering when Sterling was going to text her that he was on his way home. They had plans for the evening. Nothing elaborate. Dinner at the restaurant they had been going to since the early days, back when he could barely afford the prix-fixe menu, and she had pretended not to notice when he counted what was in his wallet before they ordered. Back when everything was simpler and real and new and not yet something she had to work to believe in. The message came from Rochelle Dupree, no words, no explanation, just the image. Simone looked at it for a long time, a very long time. She looked at it the way you look at something when your brain is trying to tell your eyes they are wrong. Sterling Whitfield was standing outside Phipps Plaza on Peachtree Road in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. His arm was around a woman who was not his wife. His hand was on the small of her back. His head was bent toward hers, at the exact angle he used when he wanted someone to feel like they were the only person in the room. She recognized the angle. She had been on the receiving end of it for 11 years. The woman was Jade Prescott, Vice President of Marketing at Whitfield Innovations, 27 years old, in a coat that Sterling's credit card had paid for. Simone knew this because she had gone to the shared account statement 40 minutes after the photograph arrived, and there it was, $1,200 to a boutique on Miami Circle 6 weeks ago. A boutique Simone had never been taken to. She sat down on the floor of the closet. The carpet was soft. It cost what some people made in a week. She sat on it and she looked at the photograph again and she waited for something to happen inside her. She waited for the walls to close in. She waited for the kind of crying that takes over your whole body. She had seen that kind before. She had held Chantal through it after Chantal's first real heartbreak, years ago, sitting on this same kind of floor in a much smaller apartment. She knew what that crying looked and sounded like. What came instead was very quiet. It was not nothing. It was something specific and still. It settled into her chest and sat there, and she recognized it the way you recognize the smell of something you associate with an old feeling. She had felt something close to this before. 14 months ago, when she had seen a hotel reservation on Sterling's shared calendar for a weekend that was not a work trip, she had told herself she was wrong. She had deleted the calendar event from her own view so she would not have to see it anymore. She had told herself she was paranoid. Lord, I knew, and I stayed anyway. She got up off the closet floor. She went to the bathroom and she sat down on the cold tile and she put both hands on her belly. The baby was moving, that slow, deliberate roll, as though she was listening. As though she had been listening for a while, paying attention from the inside while her mother worked so hard not to pay attention from the outside. I know, Simone said out loud. The marble bathroom echoed it back at her, slightly flattened. I know. She allowed herself 4 minutes in that bathroom. She counted them on the clock above the soaking tub. Then she washed her face with cold water from the Grove faucet that had cost more than her first car. She patted her face dry with the Egyptian cotton hand towel, monogrammed. Another SW. She looked at herself in the mirror that was lit from 3 sides to eliminate shadows. She thought, I am not going to cry in this bathroom. I will cry somewhere that matters. She went back to the bedroom and opened the cream-colored suitcase. 3 dresses, 2 blazers. The gray cashmere sweater Chantal had given her 3 birthdays ago that she wore when she needed to feel like herself. Her grandmother Eunice's pearl earrings, which lived in a velvet pouch in the back of the jewelry drawer, the ones she never wore because she was afraid of losing them. She took those. Then she went to the nightstand. Her side. The bottom drawer. Sterling had never opened this drawer. In 11 years, he had never opened it. She had always respected his space and he had always respected hers, and this was one of the things she had told herself was love. Respect of space. She understood now that it was not love. It was the particular coexistence of two people who had stopped truly looking at each other and found a comfortable way not to notice. She removed the folder. It was a manila folder, thick and full, with a rubber band around it. Inside, her original Emory University MBA transcript, a copy of their prenuptial agreement with specific sections highlighted in yellow, her personal credit card statements for the past 24 months, a small black external hard drive no bigger than a paperback book, and a handwritten list on yellow legal paper with 4 items on it that she had written 14 months ago, sitting in this same bedroom at 2 in the morning while Sterling slept beside her and had never been able to make herself throw away. She looked at the list. The 4 items were attorney, accounts, documentation, Rochelle. She had written it in a moment she never acknowledged again afterward. In a moment she told herself was paranoia. In a moment she had folded and put in a drawer and covered with a magazine and pretended was not there. It had always been there. She put the folder in the suitcase. She zipped it closed. She called Chantel from the elevator. The elevator dropped from the 32nd floor to the parking structure in 45 seconds. Chantel answered on the second ring the way she always did, the way she answered any call from Simone at any hour as though she had been sitting beside the phone waiting. "Hey," Chantel said. "Hey," Simone said. There was a pause. One of the pauses that exists only between siblings, the kind where no words are needed and both people know it. "It was on your phone, wasn't it?" Chantel said. Not a question. Not a question at all. Simone stood in the elevator with the suitcase handle in her right hand and her left hand pressed against the polished steel wall. The wall reflected her back at herself. 8 months pregnant, holding herself very still. She looked at her own reflection, and she looked at the statement that was not a question, and something in her chest shifted slightly, the way heavy furniture shifts when someone finally moves it from its long position. "How long have you known?" she asked. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. It was the silence of a woman who had been holding a truth for someone who was not ready to hear it. The silence of a younger sister who had sat across from her older sister at 100 meals and bitten her tongue and smiled and laughed and said nothing because the older sister was not ready, and because saying it too soon is as bad as not saying it at all. There was a particular kind of love in that silence. There was also a particular kind of grief. "Simone," Chantel said. "I am coming to Mama's house," Simone said. "I will explain when I get there. I will be there in 40 minutes, Chantel said immediately. No questions. No hesitation, just the simple logistics of a woman rearranging her life to show up for her sister. "You need me to bring anything?" "No," Simone said. "Just be there." "I will be there." The elevator opened into the parking structure. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her. The air smelled of exhaust and concrete and something metallic she associated with all parking structures everywhere. A smell that had no elegance to it. A smell that was simply what it was. After 3 years of the penthouse with its curated scents and controlled temperature, it hit her like something honest. She wheeled the suitcase to the white Lexus. Her car, her name on the registration, her account on the insurance. She had been very specific about that 3 years ago when they traded in her previous car. She had insisted her name be the only one on the registration. Sterling had thought it was a quirk. She had not been able to explain, even to herself, why it mattered so much. She knew now. She loaded the suitcase into the trunk. She sat down in the driver's seat and closed the door, and the car was quiet around her. The quiet of a space that was hers and only hers. The leather seat was warm from sitting in the sun all afternoon through the garage vents. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, and she let them rest there for a moment, and she breathed. Outside, Atlanta moved. The distant sound of the city. Traffic on Peachtree Road, 3 levels above. Someone's car alarm going off and then stopping. The particular hum of a city that does not know and does not care that everything inside this parking structure is in the process of ending. She picked up her phone. She looked at the photograph one more time. She studied Sterling's face in it. The ease of him. The carelessness. Not the carelessness of someone who had been caught off guard. The carelessness of someone who had stopped worrying about being caught at all. There was a difference between those two things, and she understood that difference now in a way she had not understood it an hour ago. An hour ago, she had still been willing to explain things away. An hour ago, she had still been willing to build a version of events that she could live inside. She was done building those. She put her phone face down on the passenger seat. She started the car. She did not know that Sterling was already on his way home. She did not know that by the time he walked that penthouse door, she would already be 45 minutes south of it. She did not know what he would do when he walked into the bedroom and found the suitcase gone. She did not know what sound he would make when he understood. She did not know any of that. What she knew was this: she was her mother's daughter. And her mother had taught her that you fold your clothes like you are putting them away for a long time, not like you are stuffing them in to leave quickly. You fold like someone who deserves the space she is moving toward, not just the space she is leaving behind. She had folded every dress carefully. The baby kicked once, sharp, definite, left side under the ribs. "I know," Simone said, again to the baby, to herself. To the car moving south on Peachtree Road toward the neighborhood she had grown up in, the neighborhood she had been moving away from her whole adult life, the neighborhood that had been there all along, quiet and brick and certain, waiting for her to come home. She turned on the radio, gospel low, just enough to fill the silence, just enough to have something else in the car with her besides the weight of what she now knew and could not unknow. She drove. She did not look back. The house on Ashby Street in the West End had been in the Barnes family since 1988. It was a brick 3-bedroom with a wide front porch and a sweet gum tree in the yard, whose roots had been lifting the sidewalk squares for 30 years. The neighborhood had changed around it and the house had stayed the same. The way things that are paid off and loved stay the same. The porch swing still had the cushions Dorothy had recovered in 1994. The flower boxes were full of marigolds in October, the way they were every October, because Dorothy Barnes planted marigolds in September every year, and she had not skipped a September yet. Simone pulled into the driveway at 4:30 in the afternoon. She had not called ahead. She had not needed to. Dorothy Barnes opened the front door before Simone reached the porch steps. She stood in the doorway in her Saturday house dress, the faded blue one with the white collar, and she looked at her daughter coming up the front walk, with a cream-colored suitcase and 8 months of pregnancy, and a face that said everything that did not need to be said out loud. Dorothy looked at her daughter's face. She said nothing. She stepped aside. She let her in. The house smelled the way it had always smelled on Saturday afternoons. Something on the stove since morning, the specific warmth of a house that had been lived in and cleaned and lived in again for decades. Simone stepped over the threshold and the smell hit her somewhere behind her sternum. Greens on the stove, low and long. A candle in the hallway, vanilla and something else, something her mother had always burned on Saturday afternoons. The carpet under her feet, the particular softness of it that she associated with being a child and coming home from school. She put the suitcase down beside the door. Dorothy closed the front door. The click of it was soft and certain. "You eat?" Dorothy asked. "No," Simone said. "All right." Dorothy went to the kitchen. Simone stood in the living room for a moment and looked at the walls, the photographs in their frames. Simone and Chantel in Easter dresses, white with lace collars, ages approximately 7 and 4. The Howard University graduation portrait. The formal family photograph from Christmas of 2012, the last Christmas before their Aunt Ruth passed. And there, on the far wall, slightly smaller than everything else around it, as though it had been placed where it would not dominate, the wedding portrait. Sterling and Simone on the steps of Greater Antioch Baptist Church in June of 2014. Sterling in his tuxedo. Simone in her mother's pearls and a dress she had found in a bridal boutique in Virginia Highland that cost less than anyone at that wedding would have guessed. She looked at the photograph. She thought, "I look happy in that picture. I was happy in that picture." That is not the lie. The lie is everything that came after. She sat down at the kitchen table. Dorothy set a cup of tea in front of her, chamomile, with honey, the way she had always made it when something was wrong. Simone wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth spread through her palms. Dorothy sat across from her. She folded her hands on the table. She did not ask a single question. She waited. There is a particular kind of wisdom in that. Simone had spent 32 years on the receiving end of her mother's ability to wait, and she had never fully appreciated it until this moment. Dorothy Barnes was a woman who understood that telling takes its own time. She had retired from 31 years as an assistant principal at Frederick Douglass High School, and she had learned early that the most important conversations were the ones you could not rush. She waited. Simone told her, "Not all of it." The words kept collapsing before they could reach the surface, the way it happens when something is too large to be spoken all at once. But enough. The photograph. Jade Prescott, Vice President of Marketing, 27 years old, and in a coat that Sterling's credit card paid for. The shared account. The folder in the suitcase. The list she had written 14 months ago. The fact that she had known something was wrong for a long time before today and had not let herself know it all the way. Dorothy listened. She listened the way she always listened, still and full, not filling the pauses with her own reactions, but letting each piece of information settle before the next one arrived. When Simone finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Then Dorothy got up, went to the stove, and stirred the greens. She came back and sat down. "Baby," she said. The word landed the way her mother's words always landed, not soft exactly, weighted. Like something that had been warned before it was offered. "I am going to tell you what I know," Dorothy said. "What I know is that you deserve better than what I accepted." Simone looked at her mother. It was the most honest thing Dorothy Barnes had ever said to her daughter, and they both understood it. Dorothy had been married to Earl Barnes for 11 years before he left. She had stayed for most of those 11 years through things she had never named to her daughters. She had stayed because the girls were small, and because the community expected it, and because naming what was happening would have made it more real than she could manage at the time. She had made peace with those choices at around age 58. She was 63 now, and she was done letting peace get in the way of truth. Simone felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. The recognition pain was arriving now, different from the shock. The shock had been clean, if not cold. This was different. This was the specific hurt of looking back and seeing clearly, of understanding that it had been real, the betrayal, yes, but also the knowing. The knowing she had done around the edges of. The knowing she had stepped over every morning for 14 months on her way to pretending everything was fine. Sterling called at 6:15. His name appeared on her phone screen. She watched it light up. She watched it pulse. She watched it stop. She watched it start again. "Dorothy said you do not have to answer that, I know," Simone said. She put the phone face down on the table. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then the timer on the stove went off and Dorothy got up to tend to it. The sound of a spoon against a pot. The smell of the greens deepening. The front door opened at 6:42. Chantal came in still wearing her hospital scrubs, still carrying her badge from the afternoon shift at Grady Memorial. She had driven directly from the hospital. She took one look at Simone at the kitchen table with the cup of tea, and she crossed the room and sat down beside her sister and put her arm around her and did not say anything for almost a full minute. That was Chantel's particular gift. She knew exactly when to talk and exactly when not to. For 60 seconds, she did not. Then she said, "Okay, tell me everything. From the beginning. And do not leave anything out because I can tell you are about to try to protect him again, and I need you to not do that right now." Simone almost laughed. It was not a full laugh, but something moved through her that was adjacent to it, and she was grateful for it. She told Chantel, all of it this time, including the parts she had softened for her mother, the full account statement, the coat from the boutique on Miami Circle, the hotel reservation on the shared calendar 14 months ago, the folder in suitcase, the list. Chantel listened. When Simone was done, Chantel sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Girl, I sat at your wedding and I smiled and I hugged him and called him my brother, and I was already worried. I am so sorry I did not say something sooner." "You could not have said it sooner," Simone said. "I was not ready to hear it. I know that. I know that." Chantel shook her head. "I still should have said it." Simone reached across and put her hand over Chantel's. "You are saying it now." The breathing room scene arrived in the space between that conversation and the next hour. Dorothy served the food at 7 in the evening. She did not ask whether anyone was hungry. She simply set plates on the table, greens and cornbread and chicken that had been in the slow cooker since morning. They ate without much talking. The kitchen held them. The sound of silverware on plates. The sound of the neighborhood outside the window, a car passing. Children somewhere down the street. Someone's music from the house next door, low and indistinct. Simone sat at her mother's kitchen table with a plate of food she had not asked for and ate it because eating was something real to do. The cornbread was sweet, the way Dorothy had always made it, slightly sweet with a crisp bottom edge that came from the cast iron skillet. She ate and she breathed and she let the kitchen be around her. The refrigerator hum. The fluorescent light above the sink that had buzzed slightly for as long as Simone could remember, and that Dorothy had never gotten around to fixing because it did not bother her the way it bothered other people. She had grown up in this kitchen. She had done her homework at this table. She had told her mother about her first heartbreak at this table. She had told her mother about Sterling at this table, sitting in this same chair, at age 21, describing a man she had just met who had a pitch deck and a dream, and who had looked at her across a coffee shop like she was the solution to a problem he had been working on for years. She thought about that. About 21-year-old Simone, certain and bright and full of something she had not yet learned to be careful with. She thought, I want that woman back. Not the certainty she knows better than that now, but the brightness, that specific brightness. I want it back. After dinner, Simone excused herself to the bathroom. It was the bathroom off the hallway, the one with the peeling edge of wallpaper near the window that Dorothy had been meaning to fix for 6 years. Simone sat down on the edge of the tub. She took out her phone. She typed, Sterling, we need to talk. She stared at it. She deleted it. She typed, I saw the photograph. She stared at that. She deleted that too. She sat on the edge of her mother's bathtub with her phone dark in her hand for 7 full minutes. The wallpaper edge lifted slightly in the draft from the window. A car drove by outside. Someone laughed, far away in another yard. She put her phone in her pocket. She washed her hands. She turned off the light and went back to the kitchen. By 10 in the evening, Chantel had put her 3 children to bed in the back bedroom. She had driven home to get them and brought them back. And Dorothy had gone to bed. And Simone was alone in the kitchen with the light on and her phone face down on the table and the house quiet around her. Sterling's name had appeared on her phone screen 14 times. She had not answered once. She went to her old bedroom, the twin bed with the white coverlet that Dorothy changed every time Simone came to visit, as though expecting her. Fresh sheets that smelled like the detergent Dorothy had used for 30 years, lavender and something clean. A glass of water on the nightstand that she had not put there. She lay down. The baby moved. She put her hand on her side and felt the movement under her palm, the specific warmth and pressure of it, a living thing making itself known from the inside. She lay in the dark of her childhood bedroom and felt her daughter moving, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way the midwife had taught her, and she let the night be what it was. She had 43 unread messages by midnight. Not one of them was from Sterling. All 43 were from people who had seen the photograph. People she recognized. People whose names she knew from church pews and business events and the kind of social gatherings that the Whitfields had become fixtures of over 11 years of a very visible life. People who had watched Sterling introduce her 100 times. People who had smiled at her 100 times. People who had said nothing 100 times. She put the phone down without reading them. The worst part was not the photograph. She understood that now, lying in the dark. The worst part was not even the affair. The worst part was how long it had been happening, and how many people had watched her not know, and how many of those people were now sending her messages at midnight, and how not a single one of them had sent her a message 6 months ago when it might have been a different kind of help. Rochelle Dupree arrived at Dorothy's house at 9 in the morning on Sunday with a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches and a face that said she had not slept. She had driven 40 minutes from her apartment in Decatur. She had not called ahead. She had simply arrived, the way she had always arrived when something happened to Simone, since the first teacher of Howard University, when they had been assigned to the same dormitory floor, and had stayed up until 3 in the morning talking and had not really stopped since. Dorothy let her in. Rochelle went straight to the kitchen and set the bag on the counter, and then she sat down across from Simone and put her hands flat on the table and took a breath. I need to tell you something, Rochelle said, and I need you to hear me all the way through before you respond to any part of it. Simone looked at her. I have been holding something, Rochelle said, for 14 months, and I am done holding it. The kitchen was quiet. Dorothy had gone to church. Chantal was in the back room with her children, visible through the doorway, braiding her daughter's hair. The sound of a child's gentle complaint and Chantal's gentle correction. The smell of the breakfast sandwiches still in the paper bag, warm and untouched. Rochelle told her. Dupree Public Relations had done marketing work for Whitfield Innovations from 2019 to 2022. During those 3 years, Rochelle had worked closely alongside the marketing team. She had attended internal strategy sessions. She had reviewed budget allocations. She had been, on several occasions, in meetings where more than company business was being discussed. She had started to notice things. A hotel reservation in Savannah for a conference weekend that was not actually a conference weekend. She had confirmed this because she had checked the industry calendar herself after something in the meeting felt wrong. An expense report for a team-building retreat that listed 6 attendees, but was charged against a budget line that should have accommodated only 2. A series of photographs from what the receipt labeled a client dinner in 2021, which included 2 settings at a table built for 2 in a restaurant she happened to know, had a particular reputation for private corner booths. She had documented it, not to use, not with any plan, simply because she was a businesswoman and something told her to document it, the same small alarm that had told Simone 14 months ago to write a list on yellow legal paper and put it in a drawer. Why didn't you tell me, Simone said. Her voice was very even. Not angry, not yet. Just asking. Rochelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because you were happy. Because I told myself I might be wrong. Because I told myself it was not my marriage and I might be reading into things. She paused. And because I knew what it would cost you to know. And I did not want to be the one who made you pay that cost. Simone sat with that. She understood it. She did not fully forgive it yet, but she understood it. She knew in the part of herself that had been honest for 14 months in the dark at 2 in the morning that she might have done the same thing. She might have held it. She might have told herself she was protecting someone she loved. I need you to send me everything you have, Simone said. A pause. Everything, Rochelle. Rochelle took out her phone. She found the folder she had organized months ago and held together for months longer than she should have. She sent it. The phone in Simone's hand vibrated as each file arrived. This was the major early twist, positioned exactly where it needed to land. Simone was not the only one who had known something was wrong. She was not the only one who had been watching the edges of her own marriage with the specific wariness of someone who suspects the foundation is compromised, but cannot bring herself to test it by pressing too hard. She had not been alone in the knowing. She had simply been alone in the not knowing what to do with the knowing. I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw, and I know exactly what I was not shown. That was the first truth that arrived fully formed, the way some truths arrive, not as a discovery but as a confirmation of something already present. She looked at her phone, at the folder Rochelle had just sent. At 14 months of evidence she had not been carrying by herself. She put the phone face down on the table. Thank you, she said. Rochelle reached across the table and covered Simone's hand with both of hers. She did not say you are welcome. She did not say I should have told you sooner. She just held her hand and let the moment be what it was. At 11 in the morning, Eugenia Whitfield called. Dorothy's phone, not Simone's. Dorothy brought it to the kitchen with a look on her face that said she had already decided who it was before she answered and had considered not answering at all. Simone took the phone. Eugenia Whitfield was 69 years old and had grown up in the Sweet Auburn neighborhood of Atlanta, the daughter of a deacon and a schoolteacher who believed firmly that the quality of your life was measured by the quality of your composure. She had raised Sterling with aspirations that had sometimes felt like demands. She had standards for how a woman presented herself in difficulty, and she was trying to maintain those standards now, and it was costing her something. Simone could hear the cost. He has made a terrible mistake, Eugenia said. Yes, Simone said, he has. A pause. Eugenia was gathering herself. Baby, she said. The word came out the way Dorothy's word came out, with that particular southern weight. You are 8 months pregnant. Please. Give him a chance to explain, Miss Eugenia, Simone said very quietly. There is no explanation for what I saw. There is only the truth. And the truth is something Sterling has had a long time to tell me and chose not to. The silence on the other end of the line was long. Then Eugenia said, I understand. Something in her voice suggested she understood more than she was saying. More than she was prepared to say on a Sunday morning with everything still raw, and the community not yet assembled and the full picture not yet clear. But the word landed the way honest words land even when they are small. She understood. She had always suspected something. She had loved her son too much to follow the suspicion anywhere useful. That was its own kind of grief. Sterling arrived at Dorothy's house at 2 in the afternoon. He pulled up in the black Range Rover, and he was still wearing the same clothes from the photograph. Simone was in the back bedroom when she heard the doorbell. She did not move. She heard Dorothy's footsteps in the hallway. She heard the front door open. Sterling, Dorothy said. Mrs. Barnes, Sterling said, I need to see Simone. My daughter is not available. His voice shifted slightly. The professional voice, the one he used in rooms where he was accustomed to being received with deference. With all due respect, Mrs. Barnes. She is not available, Dorothy said. The door closed, soft, final. The sound of it was precise and clean, the way a period at the end of a sentence is precise and clean. Simone heard every word from the hallway. She stood very still. The baby moved. She put her hand over the spot and she pressed gently and she breathed. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. First, I need to understand what I am actually dealing with. She went to the window in the back bedroom and she looked out at the backyard. Dorothy's backyard in October. The sweet gum tree dropping its spiky balls onto the grass, the way it always did this time of year. The marigolds in the flower box along the back fence, still going despite the cooler nights. A cardinal on the fence post, red and deliberate, looking at nothing in particular. The breathing room found her there. She stood at that window for a long time. The backyard sounds came in through the old window frame, wind through the sweet gum leaves. Someone down the street with a leaf blower, distant and intermittent. A dog somewhere, not alarmed, just present. The neighborhood going about its Saturday afternoon, unaware of what had come apart 2 miles away in a penthouse 32 floors up. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She thought about community standing, about what it meant to be the Whitfields in Atlanta. Sterling's name on the philanthropy wall at the Alumni Center, their photograph in the program at Greater Antioch's annual gala. The way people introduced her Mrs. Whitfield, Sterling's wife, the woman behind the man who built Whitfield Innovations from nothing. The way she had stood in rooms full of people who saw her only in relation to him and smiled and said thank you and shaken hands and driven home and been fine. The way she had been fine. She had been fine for so long. Being fine is not the same as being whole. She kept her forehead against the window glass and she let the outside sounds come in through the frame. The leaf blower, the cardinal, the sweet gum tree, the neighborhood. She thought, I was not fine. I was performing fine. And the performance was so good that I almost fooled myself. After a while, she went back to the kitchen. Chantel looked at her from across the room and did not ask where she had been or what she had been doing. She simply handed her a glass of water and sat back down. That was the whole of it, water. Sitting. The kitchen. The green smell still faintly in the air from the night before. Simone drank the water. She sat down. She opened the folder Rochelle had sent, and she began to read. By evening, she had 47 unread messages. She had not answered any of them. The community, it turned out, had been watching all along. The community had opinions. The community had already begun the particular social sorting that happens when a visible couple comes apart, who stays loyal to who reaches out to whom first, who watches from a careful distance and says nothing. She would find out soon enough which category everyone fell into. She would find out that the categories surprised her. She would find out that the people she had expected to reach for her immediately were sometimes the ones who were silent, and that the most unexpected people were sometimes the ones who showed up. She would find out all of that. But not tonight. Tonight she read Rochelle's documentation, and she made notes in the margins, and she let the recognition pain do what it needed to do, which was to make everything that had previously been possible to ignore now completely and permanently impossible to ignore. The betrayal had been happening for a long time. People in her circle had known. She had been the last to know, and she had known for 14 months, and she had not let herself know all the way. I kept his secrets and he sold mine. He let me walk through rooms full of people who were watching me not knowing. She turned off the kitchen light at midnight. She went to the twin bed in her old bedroom. She lay down and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and the baby moved slow and steady under her hand, and the neighborhood was quiet outside, and the night held her in the only house that had always been hers and only hers, and she slept. The yellow legal paper was folded in thirds. Simone unfolded it on Monday morning at Dorothy's kitchen table while the coffee was brewing, and Chantel's children were still asleep, and the house was in the specific early morning quiet that belongs to houses with sleeping children, a quiet that has texture to it, soft and temporary. She read the list again, the 4 items: attorney, accounts, documentation, Rochelle. She had written this list at 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in August of the previous year, sitting up in the penthouse bedroom while Sterling slept beside her, and she had written it because something had happened that week that she had not been able to explain away no matter how many angles she approached it from. She had written it because some part of her had known, even then, that there would be a time when she would need it. She had never intended to need it this soon. She had never truly intended to need it at all. She thought, I wrote it to make myself feel safer. I wrote it so that if I ever had to leave, I would have something to leave with. I wrote it, and then I went back to sleep beside him and acted as though I had not. She folded the paper back into thirds and put it in the folder. Then she opened her laptop. She had work to do. Not the kind of work she had been doing at Whitfield Innovations, the invisible strategic labor she had been providing for 11 years, in exchange for a title that was not on any org chart and a credit that appeared in no annual report. A different kind of work. The kind she should have been doing years ago and had not been doing because she had been busy doing someone else's. She called Vivian Hartwell at 8 in the morning. Vivian Hartwell had been recommended by Chantel's colleague, a woman who worked in the hospital's legal department and knew the Atlanta legal landscape with the specific precision of someone who had needed to navigate it more than once. The recommendation had been specific. She is the best in Georgia if you mean business, and you need to mean business. Simone meant business. Vivian answered on the third ring, which was not her personal line but her office line, which meant she was already in the office on a Monday morning at 8, which told Simone something about the kind of attorney she was. This is Vivian Hartwell. My name is Simone Whitfield, Simone said. I need to speak with you about a divorce proceeding. I was told you might be the right person. A brief pause. not hesitation. Assessment. I have a 9:15 that was just canceled, Vivian said. Can you be here by 9? Yes, Simone said. She could. The drive to Vivian Hartwell's office on Peachtree Center Avenue took 20 minutes from the West End on a Monday morning. Simone drove it with the radio off, which was unusual for her. She was a person who always had music or podcasts or something in the car. She had learned to be comfortable with sound. This morning she needed the silence. She was going through things in her mind. Not rehearsing what she would say, she had the folder and the documentation and the list, and that was enough. She was going through the memories. The ones that had been coming since she had left the penthouse, arriving uninvited, pulling her backward into moments she had lived through once already, and was now being asked to live through again with different information. The first memory came while she was at a stoplight on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, 3 years into the business. The WeWork space off Marietta Street. 12 employees and a vision that Sterling described to every room he entered with an energy that was genuinely his, genuinely compelling, the kind of energy you cannot manufacture and cannot sustain without believing in it. Simone had believed in it too. She had believed in it more than anyone because she had been the one, at age 23, who had looked at his initial pitch deck and said, quietly but specifically, the secondary analysis is missing. The investors will ask about risk management, and you have not addressed it. Let me help you with that. She had spent 3 weeks researching. She had built the entire secondary pitch deck herself. She had stress-tested every assumption and addressed every objection before the investors could voice it. On the morning of the meeting, she had been in the room. She had sat in the back row in a blazer she had found at a Buckhead consignment shop for $40 because they could not yet afford the kind of blazer this meeting required. She had been there for every slide. Sterling had introduced her to the lead investor as my beautiful wife Simone, not his partner, not the woman who built the secondary deck, not the strategist who had been working on this pitch for 3 weeks, his beautiful wife. She had smiled and shaken hands and driven home and made dinner and not said a word. The light changed. She drove. The second memory came while she was parking in the garage beneath Vivian Hartwell's building. 7 years ago. Sterling's first business trip to Dubai that she did not go on. He had said it was not worth the trip. He would be in meetings the entire time. It would be boring. She would have nothing to do. She should stay home and rest. She had believed him. She had stayed home and taken apart their master bedroom and put it back together with a new rug and new throw pillows and a different arrangement of the furniture because she had needed something to do with her hands while he was away, and she had wanted to have something to show him when he came back. He had come back and looked at the room and said it looked great. Then he had checked his phone. She had thought, he is distracted from travel. He is tired. It is nothing. It was not nothing. The third memory came while she was riding the elevator up to the 14th floor of Vivian Hartwell's building. 2 years ago. The company holiday party. Jade Prescott, newly hired, standing beside Sterling in the reception line. The way Sterling's hand had rested for just a moment a beat too long. A fraction of a gesture too familiar at the small of Jade Prescott's back as he introduced her to a board member. A gesture so quick that Simone had almost missed it. She had not missed it. She had told herself she had imagined it. I did not imagine it. I chose not to know what I already knew. Vivian Hartwell's office was on the 14th floor and smelled of good coffee and leather and the specific scent of a space that took itself seriously. The receptionist was efficient and warm. She offered Simone water, which Simone accepted, and she showed her to the conference room without delay. Vivian Hartwell came in 6 minutes later. She was 51 years old, medium height, in a charcoal suit that said she had not wasted a single morning of her career. Her hair was natural, close-cropped, silver at the temples. She had intelligent, deliberate eyes. She sat down across from Simone and opened a notepad and set her pen beside it and looked at Simone with the full attention of someone who was already listening. "Tell me what you have," Vivian said. Simone put the folder on the table. Vivian went through it carefully and without hurrying. She asked 4 questions, each more specific than the last. The prenuptial agreement, she read the fidelity clause twice. She set it aside and noted something on her pad. The credit card statements, the list of assets Simone knew about, the documentation Rochelle had sent. Then Simone put the external hard drive on the table. Vivian looked at it. "Tell me what is on this," she said. 11 years, Simone said. "Meeting notes, strategy documents, pitch decks, both versions mine and the version that went out with only his name on it. Contracts I drafted, budget analyses I built, email chains in which my suggestions appear in Sterling's name. Everything I built and everything I can prove I built." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at the hard drive. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I am going to need you to understand something. The prenuptial agreement has a fidelity clause. The photograph your friend sent you is documentation. It is the beginning of documentation, not the end of it. She paused. Are you prepared to pursue this? Simone looked at the folder, at the list, at the 4 items she had written in the dark at 2 in the morning 14 months ago. Yes, she said, I am prepared. Vivian picked up her pen. Then we have a great deal of work to do, she said, and we are going to do all of it. The breathing room came that evening back at Dorothy's house. After the meeting with Vivian, after the drive back through Monday afternoon Atlanta traffic, after picking up dinner from the busy Bee Cafe on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, macaroni and cheese and pork chops and yams and sweet tea, after eating that dinner at Dorothy's kitchen table with Chantel and the children and Dorothy herself, Simone excused herself. She went to the storage room at the back of the house. Her mother kept boxes of things back there. Christmas decorations, old tax returns, the girls' school projects, carefully boxed and labeled in Dorothy's precise handwriting. Simone was looking for something specific, and she found it in the 3rd box she opened. Her Howard University journal, the one with the blue cover and the university seal embossed on the front and her name written inside in the purple ink she had preferred at 21. She took it to the back porch. The October evening in the West End was cool and specific, carrying the particular smell of autumn in Atlanta, fallen leaves and wood smoke from somewhere, and the very faint trace of exhaust from Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard 2 streets over. The porch light was on, yellow and warm. The sweet gum tree, at the back of the yard, was dropping its balls onto the grass with small irregular sounds, each one landing separately. She sat in the porch chair and she opened the journal. Her own handwriting at 21 looked younger than she expected. Rounder. More certain in a way that youth sometimes is the certainty of not yet knowing what there is to be uncertain about. She read about her first weeks at Howard, about the dormitory and the coursework and the professor she had already decided was brilliant, about a coffee shop on Georgia Avenue where she liked to study because the light was good in the afternoon. And then in November of that first year, an entry about a young man she had met at a study group. She read what she had written about Sterling Whitfield at 21 years old. She read it with the full knowledge of who he had become, and the reading was complicated. He had been everything she described. The ambition was real. The intelligence was real. The vision was real. The way he had looked at her across that coffee shop was real. She turned pages. Near the end of the first semester, she found a sentence she had forgotten she had written. It was near the bottom of a page, alone, as though it had arrived separately from the thoughts around it. I want to build something that matters. I want to build it for myself, not for anyone else. She stopped. She read it again. She had been 21, and she had known exactly what she wanted, and she had written it down in purple ink and meant every word. She had spent 11 years building someone else's thing. She closed the journal. She held it in both hands. The sweet gum tree dropped another ball onto the grass. The porch light buzzed slightly, the way porch lights do in October. Down the street, someone's front door opened and closed. She sat on her mother's back porch in the cool October evening, and she held her old journal, and she breathed, and she let the evening be around her, and she did not try to make it anything other than what it was. She was going to build something. She could feel it forming, somewhere below thought, the way things form before they have a name. She could feel the shape of it without yet knowing what it was. It was enough, for now, to know that the shape was there. She sat outside until the chill got into her bones and the baby moved and she went in. It was Sunday, 2 weeks after she had left the penthouse, and Simone Whitfield went to church. This was a significant choice. She did not have to go. Dorothy had told her she did not have to go. Chantal had said she absolutely did not have to go and would drive to Greater Antioch and fight anyone in those pews who had something to say about it. The easier choice would have been to stay home, to sit in Dorothy's kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea and let the Sunday morning pass. But Greater Antioch Baptist Church had been hers for 8 years. She had been baptized again there as an adult, as a statement of faith that was her own and not inherited. She had been married there. She had served on the Women's Ministry Committee for 6 of those 8 years. She had organized, planned, led, and prayed in that building through seasons that had nothing to do with Sterling Whitfield, and several that had everything to do with him. She was not going to be driven out of it. She wore the blue wrap dress. She had had it for 4 years, purchased on her own credit card from a boutique in Ponce City Market on a Saturday afternoon when she was 30, and had taken herself shopping alone for the first time in a while. The dress fit her changed body carefully, accommodating the 8 months of pregnancy at the waist and falling easily below the knee. She did her hair the night before, pressing and pinning it the way she did when she needed to feel like the version of herself she recognized. She arrived 7 minutes before service and walked in alone. The congregation's response was not simple, and she had not expected it to be. Some people stood to embrace her immediately. Sister Patricia from the praise team, who gripped both of Simone's hands and said only softly, "You came. Good girl." Deacon Reeves, who nodded at her from across the sanctuary with the specific nod of an elder who sees what you are doing and respects it. The women from the Young Mothers Ministry, several of whom came to the aisle where she was being seated to squeeze her shoulder or say her name with the particular warmth of women who understood, in the cellular way of women, what she was carrying. Some people looked away. 3 women she had considered close friends from the women's ministry kept their eyes on their programs a beat too long when she passed. Not hostile, not cold. Just careful. The particular carefulness of people who have not decided yet which way the social wind is blowing and prefer not to be seen taking sides before that decision is made. Simone recognized it. She did not blame them for it. She filed it. Sterling was not there. Reverend Isaiah Caldwell preached from Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19. He read it slowly in his deep, measured voice. "I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Simone sat in the 4th pew from the front and heard it and let it arrive and did not try to decide if the Reverend Caldwell had chosen it on purpose. Maybe he had. Maybe the text was simply what the lectionary called for. Either way, she heard it the way she needed to hear it, in her body, not just her mind. After service in the vestibule, while people were gathering their children and putting on their coats and sorting through the after-church logistics that occupy the 40 minutes following service at any Black Baptist church, Mother Frances Tatum found her. Mother Tatum was 74 years old and had been a member of Greater Antioch since 1972. She had outlasted 3 senior pastors and 2 major building renovations and the departure of approximately 40% of the congregation during the split of 2007 that nobody liked to discuss. She had white hair and dark eyes and a face that had been shaped by 7 decades of specific kinds of joy and specific kinds of pain, and was therefore one of the most readable faces Simone had ever seen. She took Simone's hand in both of hers. She did not say, "I am sorry this is happening to you." She did not say, "You should pray about it," which would have meant nothing helpful. She did not say, "Marriage is work," which would have made Simone want to leave the vestibule immediately. She did not say any of the things that well-meaning people say when they do not know what to say, and fill the space with words that fit nowhere. She said, "You stood up, baby. You stood up while you were still standing. That is harder than standing up after you fall, and do not let anybody tell you different." Simone started to cry. Standing in the vestibule of Greater Antioch Baptist Church, in her blue wrap dress with her 8 months of pregnancy and her pressed hair and her pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, Simone Whitfield started to cry, and she did not stop herself. She had been not stopping herself for 2 weeks, and she was getting better at it. She was learning that the tears were not a weakness. They were information. They were the body reporting what the mind had been trying to process. She let them come, and Mother Tatum held both her hands and did not let go. After a moment, Mother Tatum said, "You are not alone in this building. You know that." Simone nodded. She could not speak yet. "And when you are ready to be loud," Mother Tatum said, "I will be louder. You understand?" Simone understood. The financial revelation arrived not in a dramatic moment, but in a Tuesday afternoon phone call from Vivian Hartwell, 3 days after the Sunday service. Simone was in Dorothy's kitchen with Amara's crib assembling. She had ordered a crib for Dorothy's house because she was going to need somewhere to put the baby when the baby arrived, and the penthouse was not an option. She was sitting on the floor with the instruction manual and the parts spread around her, and the phone rang. "I need you to sit somewhere comfortable," Vivian said. "I am already on the floor," Simone said. "Will that do?" Vivian almost laughed. Then she did not. "Yes," she said, "that will do." What Vivian had found in the 18 months preceding Simone's departure from the penthouse, Sterling Marcus Whitfield had transferred $7.4 million from joint operating accounts into a series of limited liability companies registered in the state of Delaware. The names of these limited liability companies appeared nowhere in any document associated with Whitfield Innovations. The registered agent for each one was the same individual, Jade Prescott. Simone sat on her mother's kitchen floor with the crib instructions in her hands and heard this and did not move. The refrigerator hummed. One of Chantel's children called from the back bedroom for something. A car drove down the street outside. "How long has this been going on?" Simone asked. "Based on what I can currently see," Vivian said, "the transfers began 22 months ago. But I want to keep looking before I give you a final number." 22 months. Nearly 2 years. He had not just been betraying her in a marriage. He had been rebuilding the financial architecture of the empire around a woman who was not his wife while his wife carried his child. She did not cry. Something colder and more specific arrived in place of tears. Something that had been in the folder in the nightstand for 14 months and had been waiting for exactly this kind of information to give it shape. I did not just lose a husband. I am not just losing a marriage. He stole from our child. He used her name, Jade's name, and their future together to protect money that should be in an account with my daughter's inheritance in it. She put the instruction manual down on the floor. She thought about Sterling in that investor meeting 11 years ago. The ease of him. The way the room had responded to him. The way she had helped him build the deck that sold the room. The way he had introduced her as his beautiful wife and not as the person who had built what he was presenting. She had been building his empire for 11 years. He had spent the last 22 months building a structure designed to keep her from claiming any of it. She thought, I have been code switching for his comfort for 11 years. I code switched in boardrooms to make him look more polished. I code switched at charity events to make him look more connected. I code switched at church to protect his image. And while I was doing all of that, he was building a legal wall designed to hold me out. She thought, I am done code switching for anyone else's comfort. Starting now. Validation Whisper 1 arrived quietly but with full weight. I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw, and I know exactly what I was not shown. She sat in the wreckage of the half-assembled crib parts on her mother's kitchen floor, and she said, what do I need to do next? Vivian said, bring me that hard drive. She did. 3 days later, the drive sat on Vivian's conference table, and Vivian went through it for 2 hours. The meeting notes. The pitch decks with both versions, hers and Sterling's, showing clearly that her ideas had been rebranded in his name. The contract she had drafted. The budget analyses. The emails. At the end of 2 hours, Vivian closed her laptop and looked at Simone across the table. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, you understand what you have here? I kept records, Simone said. You kept a legal case, Vivian said. You have 11 years of documented contribution to the empire that was characterized as marital support, but is legally defensible as unreimbursed professional labor and intellectual property. Combined with the prenuptial fidelity clause and the evidence of the financial transfers, you have the strongest position I have worked with in 14 years of practice. She paused. I want to be clear with you, Vivian said. This is going to be a fight. Sterling has resources and he is going to use them. But I have never seen someone walk into my office this prepared. I had a list, Simone said. Vivian looked at her. I wrote a list 14 months ago, Simone said. 4 items, attorney, accounts, documentation, Rochelle. I did not know I was going to need it this soon. But I had it. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, she could hold on to the life that people respected, or she could build a life she could actually breathe inside. She cannot have both. Not anymore. Simone looked at her. That is not a legal statement, Vivian said. That is just true. And I want you to sit with it. Because the road we are about to take is correct, and it is yours. And it is going to cost you some things you thought were permanent, before it gives you back what you are owed. I want to make sure you know that before we begin. Simone sat with it. Then she said, I have already left the house. I have already left the life. The only thing left to do is make sure that when everything shakes out, my daughter and I have what we built. She paused. Let us begin. 3 weeks after she had left the penthouse, Simone Whitfield began to get angry. Not the hot, reactive kind of anger that arrives immediately and burns itself out in a room. That kind she had not felt. She had felt shock and recognition and grief and the specific cold clarity of understanding what she was actually dealing with. But anger, real anger, the kind that is a tool rather than a reaction that took time to arrive. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was reading through the financial transfer documents Vivian had compiled. $7.4 million. 22 months. Jade Prescott's name on each registered agent form. Each filing stamped and official and designed to be invisible to a woman who had been too busy holding everything together to look for what was coming apart underneath her. She had been holding everything together for 11 years. She had been the one who organized the household, managed the event calendar, maintained the relationships with the extended family on both sides, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and the names of the children of people Sterling needed to remember as human beings rather than contacts. She had been the one who read the contracts before he signed them, who caught the clause in the 2019 lease agreement that would have cost them $200,000, who prepared the social strategy before every major public appearance. She had done all of this without a title, without a salary, without a line on any org chart, and while she had been doing all of that, he had been building an entirely separate structure designed to keep her from claiming any of it. The anger was clean. It was cold. It was the specific temperature of something that has been waiting underground and is now rising to the surface because the conditions have finally allowed it. She was done keeping quiet about what she had built. She called Chantel. "I am angry," she said when Chantel answered. Chantel was quiet for one moment. Then she said, "Good. It is about time." "I do not know what to do with it yet," Simone said. "You do not have to know what to do with it," Chantel said. "You just have to let it be what it is. It is information. It is telling you something. Let it talk." The anger was telling her, "You are worth more than this." The anger was telling her, "What you built is real and documented and legally defensible, and you are about to go get it." The anger was telling her, "You have been making yourself smaller to fit inside a life that was never fully yours, and you are done." She was done. That same week, Sterling made his first official move. His attorney, Reginald Crawford, the most expensive divorce attorney in Atlanta, the man who had handled a Falcon salary restructuring and the dissolution of a major Georgia bank holding company, sent Vivian Hartwell a letter proposing preliminary discussions about a settlement. Crawford was good. Sterling had hired the best, the way Sterling always hired the best. The letter was precisely worded and offered nothing specific while suggesting a spirit of cooperation that was designed to make the opposing counsel feel that the path of least resistance was the path of agreement. Vivian read it. She set it on the table across from Simone. "He is trying to close this before the full scope of the documentation is clear to his team," Vivian said. This letter arrived today. He retained Crawford 11 days ago. Crawford has been in this business long enough to know when his client has exposure. He wants this settled before we finish discovery. "How long is discovery?" Simone asked. "At minimum 4 months," Vivian said. "Potentially 6. And every month of discovery is another month in which we may find additional assets that his team did not disclose." "Then we do not settle yet," Simone said. "No," Vivian said. "We do not." The prenuptial agreement had been drafted by an attorney they had used jointly in the early years, a man recommended by a colleague of Sterling's who had seemed competent and thorough, and who had in fact been competent and thorough. The fidelity clause was Sterling's idea. Simone had found it romantic at the time, the gesture of a man who was declaring in a legal document that he intended to be faithful. The clause stated clearly that documented infidelity by either party would void the non-disclosure provisions and the asset limitation provisions of the agreement, restoring equal claim to all marital assets. He had written his own undoing into the prenuptial agreement with his own romantic gesture. She thought about that sometimes. She let herself think about the specific irony of it, not with satisfaction exactly. With something more like the weariness of understanding that the man you married is not the man you thought you were building a life with, and that the evidence of who he actually was had been hiding in plain sight the whole time, including in the documents he himself had insisted upon. The week before Amara was born was a week of grinding specific necessary work. Simone and Vivian worked through the hard drive together, meeting twice over video and once in person. They built a timeline. They constructed what Vivian called the contribution matrix, a document that laid out, by year and by project, what Simone had contributed to the empire and what she could prove she had contributed with documentation. The matrix was 11 years long, and it was, Vivian said more than once, the most thorough work product she had ever seen a client bring to a case. "You built this while you were living it," Vivian said. "I did not know I was building it," Simone said. "I kept records because that is what I do. It is who I am. I have always kept records." "That is exactly the right answer," Vivian said. Sterling called 3 more times that week. She did not answer any of the calls. She let Vivian handle all communication that needed to be handled. This was not avoidance. This was the strategic decision of a woman who understood that she was most likely to lose ground in an emotional conversation and most likely to gain it in a legal document. She had run out of emotional conversations she was willing to have unprepared. On the Thursday of that week, Chantel came over in the evening after her shift, and they sat on Dorothy's front porch in the October dark, Chantel in the porch swing and Simone in the chair, and they drank sweet tea and talked about something that had nothing to do with Sterling Whitfield for 40 minutes. They talked about Chantel's middle child, who had started saying things that were funnier than any child that age had a right to be. They talked about a television show they had both been watching. They talked about the marigolds in the flower box, still hanging on despite the overnight temperatures dropping. It was the first conversation in 3 weeks that had not been about the situation. It was necessary. After Chantel went home, Simone sat alone on the porch. The West End neighborhood at 10 in the evening in October. The sweet gum tree dropping its last balls of the season into the yard. The sound of traffic on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard 2 streets over. A porch light down the street going on and then off. The specific smell of October in Atlanta. That particular combination of cooling air and wood smoke and the ghost of summer that lingers here longer than anywhere else. She thought about the neighborhood she was going to build. She did not yet know what it was going to look like exactly. She had the concept, the 2-year-old document on her hard drive that she had never shown Sterling. A real estate development concept focused on affordable luxury projects in historically Black Atlanta neighborhoods, culturally authentic design, local artists and artisans woven into the structures from the ground floor up, community space built in, not added on as an afterthought, the kind of development that understood where it was being built and for whom. She had been holding that idea for 2 years. She had told herself she would get to it eventually. She had told herself that eventually she would have time and resources and bandwidth. She had time now. Not the comfortable kind, the necessary kind. The kind that arrives when everything you have been too busy to do is suddenly the only thing left. She sat on the porch and she breathed the October air and she let the neighborhood hold her. I was quiet for years. I am done being quiet. The second validation whisper arrived there on that porch in the dark. I kept his secrets and he sold mine. He let me walk through rooms full of people who were watching me not knowing. I am done carrying secrets that do not belong to me. She went inside, she opened her laptop, she created a new folder on her desktop and she named it Barnes Development. Then she opened the 2-year-old document and she read it from the beginning. The concept was still good. It was better than good. It was exactly what she had known it was when she wrote it and then locked it away because she had not been ready to pursue it, or had not been allowed to pursue it, or had not been in a position where pursuing it seemed possible. She was in that position now. She read every word of the concept document. Then she opened a new page and she began to add to it. She wrote for 2 hours. She was 8 months pregnant and sitting at her mother's kitchen table at midnight, and she was writing a business plan that was entirely her own, and she had not felt this alive since she tried to remember when. Since she was 21, since she had been sitting in a coffee shop on Georgia Avenue and knowing deeply and certainly that she was going to build something that mattered. She closed the laptop at midnight. She went to bed. She slept better than she had slept in 3 weeks. At 6:43 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, Amara Whitfield was born. She was 6 pounds and 2 ounces, and she arrived 3 weeks ahead of schedule. And she was, from the first moment, the most perfect person Simone had ever seen in her life. She had her father's cheekbones and her mother's eyes, and a serious expression that made the nurses laugh. She did not cry right away. She looked around with the concentrated attention of someone who had arrived in a new country and was taking inventory. This is what Simone had to say about that. She had been wrong to think she was prepared for this moment. She had read every book and taken every class and talked to every mother in her circle and done everything a person does to prepare for a birth. None of it had been preparation. The preparation turned out to be irrelevant because nothing that is actually true is something you can prepare for. You can only experience it and try to stay in your body while it happens. She stayed in her body. She was at Emory University Hospital and it was 6:43 in the morning on a Wednesday, and her baby was here and her marriage was over. And her mother was on her right side holding her hand with both hands. And Sterling Whitfield was on her left, and life, which makes no accommodations for inconvenient timing, had arranged all of this to happen at the same moment. Dorothy had called Sterling. Simone had said yes, do it, because the child deserved to have her father present at her birth. The marriage was over. The father was still the father. These were different things, and Simone needed to keep them different. Sterling arrived at 4:50 in the morning. He was wearing the first clothes he had grabbed, which meant he had not been asleep. Simone could tell by the particular hollow look of a person who has been awake for too long that he had not slept in some time. He came into the room and he stood on the left side of the bed and he looked at her. He said, "Simone." She said, "Not now, okay? Not now." He closed his mouth. He stood on the left side of the bed. He did not reach for her hand. Dorothy held her right hand with both of hers. The birth happened. It happened across hours that felt both very long and very short. The monitors and the fluorescent lights and the cold of the hospital floor through her socks when they had her walk the hallway at 3 in the morning, and the specific smell of the hospital, antiseptic, and something underneath it that was human and alive. The sound of other labor rooms down the corridor, the sound of the building breathing around all of them, the sound of Emory University Hospital in the very early hours of a Wednesday morning, and then Amara, and then the cry, which was not what Simone had expected because she had expected something small, and this cry was enormous. A declaration, an announcement, a full statement delivered with confidence. Sterling was crying. He was turned toward the window, his hand over his mouth, crying quietly. And Simone saw it over the shoulder of the nurse, who was handing her the baby, and she felt something she had not expected. Not forgiveness. Not softness. Something more like grief. The specific grief of seeing what a person could have been and understanding all at once that the person they were had prevented it. She looked at Amara. 6 pounds and 2 ounces. Dark eyes blinking in the fluorescent light. The serious expression already present. The most perfect person she had ever seen. My children will not grow up thinking a man's silence is the same thing as safety. The third validation whisper arrived there at 6:44 in the morning, 1 minute after Amara Whitfield came into the world. She is here, she is real, and I am her mother. Whatever comes next, I am her mother. The breathing room scene unfolded over the 3 days in the hospital that followed. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. There was no drama in Simone sitting in the hospital bed on the first morning after Amara's birth, learning how to feed her daughter. There was no drama in Dorothy sitting in the visitor's chair and passing a paper cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria with both hands and not saying anything for a while. There was no drama in Chantel arriving at 7 in the morning on the first full day with 3 breakfast sandwiches and her children, who were not allowed in the maternity ward, but who sent small crayon drawings through Chantel that covered approximately the emotional range of a full art exhibition. Sterling came on the second day. He sat in the visitor's chair when Dorothy stepped out. He held Amara, who was asleep, with the careful, frightened attention of a large man holding something small and precious. He held her the way you hold something you know you do not deserve access to but cannot stop loving. His face did something when he held her. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or deception or image management. Something that was simply a father looking at his daughter for the first time and understanding, in his body rather than his mind, what he had done. Simone watched him. She felt 2 things simultaneously. She felt the grief of watching the man she had loved for 11 years look at their daughter and understand what he had destroyed. She also felt something like resolve, like the specific clarity that arrives when you see someone fully, without the softening that love has been providing, and you understand what you are actually dealing with. 2 things at the same time. That was the hardest part. Not one feeling or the other. Both of them. She came home from the hospital 4 days after Amara was born. Home being Dorothy's house on Ashby Street. Dorothy had the back bedroom ready with the crib assembled and a bassinet beside the bed, and the specific preparation of a woman who has raised children and knows exactly what is needed and exactly where to put it. Amara slept in the bassinet. Simone slept in the twin bed. The house accommodated all of them. It was 6 weeks after Amara's birth when Simone brought the hard drive to Vivian Hartwell's office. Amara was 6 weeks old and asleep in Dorothy's arms in the waiting area. Vivian had said, "Bring the child, it is fine. This is not the kind of office that cannot accommodate a baby." Simone had appreciated that. She put the hard drive on the conference table. Vivian went through it for 2 hours. She was thorough and she was silent while she worked, only occasionally asking a clarifying question. What was this project? When was this email sent? Was this your signature on the contract or his? Was there a version of this deck before this version? At the end of 2 hours, she closed her laptop. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "Do you understand what you have here?" "I kept records," Simone said. "You kept a legal case," Vivian said. "You have documented contribution to an empire that was characterized as wifely support, but is legally defensible as unreimbursed professional labor and intellectual property. Combined with the prenuptial fidelity clause and the financial transfer evidence, you have the strongest position I have worked with in 14 years. Simone thought about the 21-year-old woman in the journal, the one who had written, "I want to build something that matters. I want to build it for myself." "What do we do with it?" Simone said. "We use it," Vivian said, "carefully, surgically. And we let Sterling's attorneys get the first look at it in discovery, when they will understand for the first time what they are actually dealing with." She paused. "He is going to offer you something soon," Vivian said. "Crawford has been in this business long enough to sense exposure. When the offer comes, we do not accept it. We let them come to us with a real number." "How will I know when it is a real number?" Simone asked. "You will know," Vivian said, "because I will be there and I will tell you." Darnell Whitfield called on a Thursday evening in December. Amara was 8 weeks old. Dorothy was watching the evening news. Chantel had gone home to her own family for the night. Simone was in the rocking chair in the corner of Dorothy's bedroom with Amara asleep against her shoulder, the specific warm weight of a sleeping baby that makes the world very quiet and very immediate at once. The phone rang from a number she did not recognize, she answered. "Simone," the voice said, "it is Darnell. I need to tell you something. And I need you to know that I am sorry it took me this long." Darnell Whitfield was 40 years old and had been the chief financial officer of Whitfield Innovations since it was incorporated. He was Sterling's cousin. He had grown up in the same Decatur neighborhood and had watched Sterling build the company from a kitchen table business plan and had been there for every step of the way. He knew exactly how the finances were structured. He knew what had been moved and when and where it had gone. He told her, the $7.4 million in the Delaware Limited Liability Companies was not the whole picture. There was also a trust structure, established 4 years ago, which held additional assets routed through 3 subsidiary companies. The trust registered beneficiary was Sterling Whitfield's name alone. It was structured to appear as a business asset protection strategy while functioning as personal wealth protection specifically, the kind of structure designed to minimize the exposure to a spouse's divorce claim. He named the attorney Sterling had used. He told her the name of all 3 subsidiary companies. He sent her a document package while they were on the phone. Why, Simone said. Why are you doing this? The pause was long enough to be honest. Because he is my cousin and I love him, Darnell said. And because what he did is wrong. And because that is your daughter sleeping on your shoulder right now and she deserves better. And because I have been telling myself it was not my business for long enough that I finally cannot tell myself that anymore. He paused. I am still his cousin after this, he said. I want you to understand that. I am not betraying him. I am correcting something that should not have been done. I understand, Simone said. Thank you, Darnell. I am sorry, Simone, he said. I am genuinely sorry, he hung up. Simone sat in the rocking chair with Amara asleep against her shoulder. The house was quiet. Dorothy's television was a low murmur from down the hall. The rocking chair creaked slightly on its arc. Amara breathed. She had been going to do this. She had been going to do this alone, and she had been prepared to do it alone. And now there was Darnell, and there was Rochelle, and there was Vivian, and there was Dorothy, and there was Chantel, and there was Mother Tatum, who had held her hands in the vestibule, and there was Reverend Caldwell, who had preached from Isaiah and had perhaps meant it directly. She had not been as alone as it had felt. She had been alone inside the marriage. That was true. That was its own specific category of alone that required its own specific grief. But outside the marriage, she had been held all along. She had simply not let herself lean into it. She let herself lean into it now. The breathing room came that night. After she had transferred Amara to the bassinet and sent Darnell's documents to Vivian by email and made a note of everything he had told her in the legal notepad she kept on the nightstand, she sat down in the rocking chair again and she allowed herself to do what she had not allowed herself to do since the night she had left the penthouse. She cried. Not the 4-minute measured cry she had given herself in the penthouse bathroom. Not the public, witnessed tears in Greater Antioch's vestibule. This was something else. This was the cry of a woman who had held it together through discovery and documentation and childbirth and hospital rooms and attorneys' offices and church pews and her mother's kitchen table and had reached a moment where her body simply required that she stop holding it. She cried for 15 minutes, quietly because Amara was sleeping and the house was quiet and she was not yet ready to be witnessed in this. She cried for 11 years of invisible labor. She cried for the marriage she had believed in. She cried for the 21-year-old woman with the journal who had wanted to build something for herself and had spent 11 years building something for someone else. She cried for the specific grief of understanding how much of her own story she had been missing while she was busy being a supporting character in someone else's. After 15 minutes, she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She adjusted Amara's blanket in the bassinet. She picked up the legal notepad and she began to make a list in her head of everything she still needed to do. She had a great deal left to do. She was ready to do it. It was 3 in the morning in the 2nd month after Amara's birth, and Simone was awake in the rocking chair, and the house was quiet, and everything was very heavy. This was the particular territory of 3 in the morning with a new baby and a divorce in progress and a life being dismantled and rebuilt simultaneously. It was a specific kind of dark, not dangerous, not the darkness that needs intervention. The darkness of enormous change that happens faster than the human nervous system can integrate, that requires processing in small doses, and often chooses 3 in the morning to demand that processing because 3 in the morning is when all the structures you have built to manage yourself in the daytime are quietly offline. Amara was asleep. She had been asleep for 45 minutes. She would be awake again in an hour and a half, approximately, and Simone had learned to think of the space between feedings as its own complete unit of time, not as insufficient sleep, but as its own particular kind of rest. She sat in the rocking chair in the dark bedroom, and she let the weight of it sit with her. The weight was specific. It had components that she could name and components she could not yet name. The named ones, the legal process, which was grinding forward with the specific slowness that Vivian had warned her about, the months of discovery ahead of them, the financial uncertainty of a life in transition. The fact that she was sleeping in a twin bed in her childhood bedroom at 32 years old, which she had not allowed herself to feel the full reality of, because feeling the full reality of it seemed like it would cost something she could not afford to spend. The unnamed weight was bigger. It was the shape of 11 years. It was the specific loss of something that had been real, even if it had also been compromised. She had loved Sterling Whitfield. That was not a lie. Whatever he had done, whatever the marriage had actually been, she had loved it and she had loved him. And losing something real, even when it has been proven false in places, is still loss. The grief is real even when the relationship that generated it was less than it claimed to be. She sat in the dark and she let the weight be what it was. She picked up her phone. She pulled up Dorothy's name. She looked at it for a long time. She wanted to call her mother. She wanted to call her mother at 3 in the morning and not say anything, just breathe into the phone the way she had done 3 times as a child when the fear had been too big to name. She wanted to hear her mother breathing on the other end of the line, the specific sound of a person who has survived everything that has been sent at them so far and is therefore still there, still breathing, still answering at 3 in the morning. She put the phone down because her mother would hear it in her voice. That was the truth of it. Dorothy Barnes would answer the phone at 3 in the morning and hear exactly what she was not saying, and she would come down the hallway and she would hold her daughter, and it would be exactly what Simone needed and also, somehow, not yet. She was not ready for Dorothy to carry this weight. She was not ready to put it somewhere else yet. She needed to carry it a little longer herself until she understood it better. She did what she always did when the pain got too big for her body. She picked up the phone to call her mother, and then she put it back down. Because her mother would hear it in her voice. And she was not ready for her mother to know how heavy it was right now. She sat with it. After a while, she thought about Amara. She looked at the bassinet. She could see the small rise and fall of the blanket that meant Amara was breathing, was there, was real and perfect, and already, at 8 weeks old, developing opinions about the world. Amara had opinions. They were communicated primarily through facial expressions and the strategic deployment of sound, but they were clearly opinions. She thought about what she wanted for Amara. Not practically, the practical list was long, and she thought about it constantly. It was the companion of every legal meeting and every sleepless hour. She thought about what she wanted Amara to understand someday, about who her mother was and how she had moved through the hardest period of her life. She wanted Amara to see a woman who had been knocked down and had gotten up. Not dramatically, not with heroics. Simply had gotten up, had done the next necessary thing, had kept her word to herself even when keeping it was the harder choice. She wanted Amara to see her mother choose herself. That thought was so specific and so clarifying that it changed the quality of the darkness in the room slightly. She was choosing herself. She had been choosing herself since the moment she had folded her dresses carefully in that penthouse bedroom. She had been choosing herself in Vivian's conference room and in the church vestibule and at her mother's kitchen table. She had been choosing herself every time she had not answered Sterling's calls when she was not ready to answer them. She had been choosing herself. Amara would see that. Whatever came next, Amara would see a woman who had chosen herself when choosing was hardest. The next morning, Sterling arrived at Dorothy's house at 10. He rang the bell. Dorothy answered. He said he needed to see Amara. Dorothy said Simone would call him about a time. He said he needed to know his daughter. Dorothy said he would. She closed the door. Simone had been in the kitchen, listening. She had Amara in the carrier against her chest, warm and awake, looking at the kitchen ceiling with her characteristic focus. Simone stood in the kitchen and breathed. Then she called Vivian. He came to the house, she said. His attorneys have formally requested a visitation schedule, Vivian said. That is the next step we need to address. I want him to know his daughter, Simone said. I want that on the record. I am not going to fight visitation. I am going to fight for what we built. Those are different fights, and I am not going to mix them. That is exactly right, Vivian said. And it is exactly the right framing. The visitation schedule was the first negotiation that happened between their teams. It happened relatively cleanly. Simone had said what she meant. She wanted Amara to know her father. She was not going to use Amara as leverage in a financial negotiation. They were going to build a structure that served the child and only secondarily the adults. Crawford's team had been prepared for a fight and did not quite know what to do with the absence of one on this particular point. The financial negotiation was a different conversation. Sterling made his first settlement offer 11 weeks after Amara's birth. Crawford sent it through Vivian. It proposed 40% of disclosed marital assets, primary physical custody to Simone with generous visitation for Sterling, and a non-disclosure agreement covering the terms of the settlement and all related matters. Vivian brought it to Simone on a Tuesday afternoon. "What does 40% of disclosed marital assets mean?" Simone said, "given what we know is undisclosed." "It means approximately $1.2 million on paper," Vivian said, "against a total exposed position that our current analysis places at between $45 and $52 million. Simone looked at the offer document. $1.2 million against $52 million. 40% of the visible portion of a fortune that had been structured to keep most of itself invisible. "No," she said. Vivian nodded. She had expected that. "What do we do?" Simone asked. "We continue discovery," Vivian said. "We let them understand through the process that we know what they think we do not know. Every month of discovery is another month in which the full picture becomes clearer. Crawford is smart enough to know this. Eventually, he will advise Sterling to come to the table with a real number." "How long?" Simone said. 4 to 6 months, Vivian said. "I know that is not what you want to hear." Simone thought about Amara in the carrier against her chest at Dorothy's house. Amara, who was 8 weeks old and who had never known the penthouse and who was already, somehow, entirely at home in the West End house on Ashby Street, as though she recognized something in the foundation of the place that her mother had grown up in. "I can wait," Simone said. "If waiting means getting it right." "Waiting means getting it right," Vivian said. The breathing room came that evening. Simone drove to Greater Antioch Baptist Church after dark. Not for a service. Not for a meeting. She went alone, parked in the lot, walked to the side door that she knew the youth director sometimes left unlocked until 9 in the evening, and she went inside. The sanctuary was dim and empty. The overhead lights were off. The only light came from the small fixture above the altar area, the one that stayed on all night, and from the street light coming through the high stained glass windows. The colors of the windows were muted at night, the blues and purples and golds reduced to shadows of themselves, suggesting rather than declaring. She sat down in the fourth pew from the front. Her pew. 8 years of Sundays in the same pew, slightly left of center, because Sterling preferred the center, and she had learned to prefer the slight left. She sat in her pew and the church was quiet around her. The sanctuary smelled of wood polish and old hymnals, and the faint trace of candle wax from the Sunday service, and something else beneath all of it. Something that she associated with all the large rooms in which people have gathered over many years to bring their truest selves, grief and gratitude, and the specific weight of communal faith. She sat there. She did not pray, exactly. She was not in the part of this process where prayer was clean and sequential and produced identifiable results. She was in the part where faith was something she held onto with both hands, not because it was comforting, but because it was true. Because she had chosen it and continued to choose it, even when the choosing was more work than comfort. She thought about Reverend Caldwell's text. She thought about Isaiah. "Behold, I am doing a new thing." She thought, "I do not know yet what the new thing is. I know it is coming. I can feel the shape of it the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. I just cannot see it yet." She sat in the sanctuary for 40 minutes. When she heard the janitor's keys in the side corridor, she gathered herself, stood up quietly, and let herself out. The night air hit her face when she pushed open the door. Cool and real. The parking lot was mostly empty. Her car was where she had left it. The city went on doing what the city does. My mother did not raise me to disappear inside somebody else's name. The fourth validation whisper arrived there, in the parking lot of Greater Antioch, standing in the night air with the church at her back, and the city in front of her and Amara's car seat in the back of the white Lexus. She got in the car. She drove home. Amara was 2 months old when Jade Prescott called. It was 2:47 in the morning, the same time exactly that the photograph had arrived. Simone noticed the time when her phone lit up with an unknown number. She almost did not answer. Then she answered. The voice was unfamiliar and careful and young. "This is Jade Prescott," the voice said. Silence. Simone was in the rocking chair in Dorothy's bedroom with Amara against her shoulder, exactly where she was every night at this hour. The house was quiet. The street outside was quiet. "I know you do not want to hear from me," Jade said. "I know there is probably nothing I can say to you that makes any of this better, but I have something you need to know, and I need to say it to you directly, because you deserve to hear it directly." Simone sat very still. Amara breathed against her neck, warm and even. "Talk," Simone said. Jade talked. She had been at Whitfield Innovations for 3 years. She had been hired by Sterling directly over the objections of the internal candidate and 2 senior staff members who had filed formal objections to the hire. She had known going in that the hiring process was unusual. She had told herself it was because she was the best candidate. She had believed that. She had continued to believe it for some time. The relationship with Sterling had begun, she said, approximately 14 months after she was hired. He had told her, in the first conversation in which the subject came up, that his marriage to Simone had been a business arrangement that had evolved into a personal obligation. He had told her that Simone knew the marriage was over. He had told her that the two of them had been living essentially separate lives for years, and that the separation was already in process. None of that had been true. He had also told her that the pregnancy, Amara's pregnancy, had been unplanned, and that Simone had expressed ambivalence about continuing it. He had said they had discussed it, and that Simone had ultimately decided to proceed, reluctantly. He had presented this as further evidence that the marriage was over in every meaningful sense. That was also not true. Amara's pregnancy had been planned with joy. Simone had tracked her cycle for 8 months and prayed over it and told Sterling the night she found out with a card she had written by hand. They had sat together in the penthouse and cried with happiness. She remembered the exact quality of Sterling's face when she had told him. She had understood it as love. She understood now that it had been something more complicated. But she had not been ambivalent. She had never been ambivalent. He had lied to Jade about all of it. He had lied to create the conditions under which Jade would feel that what she was doing was not what she was doing. Jade had believed him. She had felt guilty and suppressed the guilt, and told herself the guilt was unreasonable because the marriage was already over, and she was not breaking anything that had not already been broken. She had done the moral math of a woman who wanted to believe what she was being told because what she was being told made the situation tolerable. "I know you probably do not care about my situation," Jade said. "I know I do not have the right to your sympathy. I am not asking for it. I just need you to know what he told me, because it matters for your case, and because you deserve to know it." Simone sat in the rocking chair in the dark bedroom with her daughter breathing against her shoulder. She thought about what she felt. She went through the inventory of it carefully. She found, beneath the layers of the situation, something she had not expected to find, not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever, but something adjacent to understanding. The specific understanding of a woman who had also been given a version of Sterling Whitfield that was not the whole picture, who had also built a reality around that incomplete version and done her best inside it. "Did you love him?" Simone asked. The pause was long enough to be honest. "I thought I did," Jade said. "I think I loved who he told me he was." Simone closed her eyes. "I know what that is," she said. "I did that for 11 years. The silence between them was different after that. Not comfortable, but human. There is more," Jade said. She said, retained her own attorney after discovering the text messages on the second phone Sterling had left at her apartment in error. The text messages had been between Sterling and his attorney, Reginald Crawford, and they had been specific about the financial strategy being employed. She had read them. She had understood that she was registered as agent on the Delaware Limited Liability Companies, not because Sterling had trusted her with his wealth, but because her name, as an individual with no prior connection to Whitfield Innovations at the time of filing, created a layer of legal obscurity between the assets and their origin. She had been used as a legal shield. She was removing herself from every registered agent position. She had filed the paperwork already. She was also prepared to provide a sworn statement about what Sterling had told her about the marriage, which constituted, her own attorney had advised her, misrepresentation that affected several provisions of his legal defense. "You do not have to do this," Simone said. "Yes," Jade said. "I do, not for you. For myself. I need to not be the person who knew something and did not say it." She paused. "I am going to tell you one more thing," she said, "and then I am going to let you go because it is almost 3 in the morning and your daughter needs you to sleep." "Tell me," Simone said. "He told me she would never fight," Jade said. "He told me you were the kind of woman who would walk away clean because you were too dignified to get into a long legal battle. He told me that was your nature, that you would protect the family name and take whatever was offered and move on." Simone breathed. "He was wrong," she said. "Yes," Jade said, "he was." She thought he loved the version of me that made him look better. He loved the version of her that let him lie better. He did not love either one of us. The fifth validation whisper arrived there at 2:47 in the morning, in a rocking chair in her mother's bedroom with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder. She texted Vivian, "Call me in the morning. Jade Prescott just called. She has information." She put the phone down. She held Amara. She thought about what Jade had said, that Sterling had told her Simone would walk away clean, that he had counted on her dignity to limit her, that he had understood her character well enough to use it against her. She had been building something in silence for 11 years, and he had known that silence and had relied upon it, and had told himself it made her predictable. He had made a significant error. She had been quiet for years. She was done being quiet. The next morning she called Rochelle. It was 7 in the morning and Amara had just gone back to sleep after her 5 o'clock feeding, and the house was in the early quiet of a December day. The light was gray and thin through the kitchen window. Dorothy was making coffee. Simone sat at the kitchen table with the phone. "I need to talk to you about something that is not the legal case," she said when Rochelle answered. Rochelle was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "I am here." "I want to build something," Simone said. "I have a concept I have been holding for 2 years, a real estate development concept. Affordable luxury in historically Black Atlanta neighborhoods. Culturally authentic design. Community space built in from the beginning. Local artisans. Everything I have been thinking about since before the marriage started to go wrong." A pause. "Simone," Rochelle said, "you have a 2-month-old baby and a divorce in progress." "I know that," Simone said. "I am not saying that as an objection," Rochelle said. "I am saying it so you know that I know how hard this is, and I am still about to say yes." Simone smiled. "Are you? When have you ever come to me with something that was not worth doing?" Rochelle said. "You have the worst possible timing and the best possible ideas. Tell me everything." Simone told her everything. She told her about the concept document she had written 2 years ago and never shown anyone, the specific neighborhoods, the design philosophy, the community partnership model, the economic rationale for why the affordable luxury market in historically Black Atlanta neighborhoods was underserved, and why a developer who actually understood those communities from the inside could do something no one had done yet. Rochelle listened without interrupting. When Simone finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Rochelle said, "I want to be your first hire." Simone said, "You have your own firm." "Yes," Rochelle said, "and I am choosing to also be your first hire. Part-time, consulting, whatever you need. My firm does not need me every minute of every day, and you do." She paused. "We should have been business partners 10 years ago. We are going to be now." Simone held the phone and looked at the kitchen window and the gray December light coming through it. Dorothy was moving behind her, coffee cup in hand, not listening, giving her daughter the space to have this conversation. "Okay," Simone said. "Okay," Rochelle said. She held the phone and she thought, "I have not laughed, not really laughed, with my whole body, in years. I am going to work on that." The building of something new had begun. Discovery, as Vivian Hartwell had explained it, was the part of a legal proceeding that was not dramatic. It was paper and time. It was requests and responses and objections and responses to objections. It was financial analysis and document review and interrogatories, which were written questions that both parties were required to answer under oath, and depositions that were scheduled and rescheduled and scheduled again. It was months of this. Vivian had said 4 to 6 months, and she had been accurate. It was exactly that. Simone learned to live inside the grinding patience of it. She learned this partly because she had no choice, and partly because she was better at it than she had expected. She had always been good at the long game. She had been playing a long game, in some sense, since the night she had written the list on yellow legal paper. Since, perhaps, before that. Amara was 4 months old when Sterling's team filed their first major objection to Vivian's discovery requests. The objection concerned the hard drive and the documentation Simone had compiled. Crawford argued that the materials on the hard drive were not relevant to the divorce proceeding because they predated the marriage, were the product of voluntary contributions by Simone to a joint enterprise, and contained no evidence of financial misconduct on Sterling's part. Vivian filed a response. The response was 37 pages long and cited 14 precedents from Georgia family law and 3 from neighboring states on the question of intellectual property contributed by a spouse to a marital enterprise. It was, Vivian told Simone when she sent the copy, one of the better responses she had written in recent memory. "He did not anticipate the intellectual property argument," Vivian said. "Crawford is smart enough to have found it eventually, but Sterling told him there was no documentation. Sterling told him you had never formalized your contributions. He did not know about the hard drive. He never opened my nightstand drawer," Simone said. Vivian looked at her. "He never opened my nightstand drawer," Simone said again. "In 11 years, he never opened it." Vivian set her pen down. "Tell me something," she said. "When did you know you were going to need those records?" Simone thought about it. She thought about the hotel reservation on the shared calendar, about the moment 14 months ago at 2 in the morning, about the list, about the quiet accumulation of documents over years, not in anticipation of any specific event, but out of the deep cellular understanding that what she had built was real and should be recorded as real. "I do not know that I ever decided," she said. "I just kept records. It is who I am." "Mrs. Whitfield," Vivian said. "The woman who just decided to document 11 years of contribution to a billion-dollar enterprise out of professional habit is the same woman who built the contribution worth documenting. I want you to understand that. Not as a compliment, as a fact. The Atlanta Black Business Council reached out to Simone in month 4 of the discovery process. Came to her personal account from the executive director, a woman named Dr. Sandra Mosley, whom Simone knew by reputation but had never met directly. The council was extending an invitation to membership. The email was warm, specific, and notable for what it did not say. It did not reference Sterling Whitfield. It did not reference her status as his wife or former wife. It addressed her as Simone Barnes, founder of Barnes Development Group, limited liability company. She had registered Barnes Development Group 4 months earlier. She had been using that name in emails and business conversations for all of that time. Somewhere in the Atlanta business community, the name had landed. She accepted the invitation. Her first council meeting was on a Thursday morning in April, when Amara was 5 months old and sitting up with assistants and had recently discovered that she could make her grandmother laugh by doing almost nothing at all. Simone left Amara with Dorothy and drove to the meeting in the white Lexus and went inside a room full of Atlanta's black business leadership. She was introduced as Simone Barnes, not as Sterling Whitfield's wife, not as the former Mrs. Whitfield, as Simone Barnes, founder of Barnes Development Group. She sat in her chair at the long conference table, and she listened and she spoke when she had something to say, which turned out to be more than once. The project she was developing in the Pittsburgh neighborhood still in early stages, still being financed through the initial capital she had access to, and the small seed investment Rochelle had put in landed with the council members in a way that told her she had identified something real. People leaned forward when she described it. People asked specific questions. People wanted to know the timeline and the community partnership model and the financing structure and the design philosophy. She answered every question. She drove home from that meeting at noon and sat in her car in Dorothy's driveway for a moment before she went in. Not the long sit of grief that she had done in the parking structure of the Buckhead penthouse. A different kind of sitting. The sitting of someone who has just done something that aligned with who she actually was and is taking a moment to register it. The breathing room came that afternoon. She put Amara in the carrier and she walked through the West End neighborhood in the spring air. The dogwoods were blooming, scattered white across the yards along the street, the specific April beauty of Atlanta when it is being its most beautiful. The sweet gum tree in Dorothy's yard had new leaves, small and green. The marigolds from the previous October had been replaced by spring plantings, yellow and orange, the same colors every year because Dorothy was a woman of consistent preferences. She walked and pushed and breathed and let the neighborhood surround her. She thought about the Pittsburgh neighborhood and what she was building there. Not just the building, the idea of the building. The specific idea that a developer could understand a neighborhood from the inside. That the people who built the spaces mattered as much as the spaces themselves. That culturally authentic design was not an add-on but a foundation. That community space was not a concession but a structural value. She thought, I have been building for someone else's vision for 11 years. This is what it feels like to build for my own. She thought about what her grandmother Eunice had told her. When she was 12 years old and had made something with her hands, she could not remember now what it was. A project for school, something with clay or paper or wire, and had been uncertain about whether it was good. Her grandmother had said, baby, nothing you make with your own hands is wrong. It is yours and it is real. And that is enough to start with. That was enough to start with. She walked the neighborhood until Amara fell asleep in the carrier, warm against her chest, breathing the April air. Then she turned back toward the house. Sterling's team made a second settlement offer in month 5. It was better than the first. Not good enough, but better. 58% of disclosed assets and a significant child support commitment and visitation terms that were fair. Still with the non-disclosure agreement. Still with the deliberately constrained definition of disclosed assets that Vivian's team had been dismantling for 4 months. No, Simone said. Correct, Vivian said. She thought about Jade's words. He told me you would walk away clean. He told me you were too dignified to get into a long legal battle. She thought, he was right that I am dignified. He was wrong that dignity and fight cannot coexist. He confused composure with accommodation. I am composed. I am not accommodating. She thought, his money was never mine. And I built more than he knows. The 6th validation whisper arrived there in Vivian Hartwell's conference room on a Tuesday in April. I built more than he knows. And what I built with my own hands is mine. The law is going to agree with me. When does he come to the table with a real number, she said. After the deposition, Vivian said. He will come after the deposition. Amara was 5 months old and had opinions about the rocking chair specifically and would allow herself to be put to sleep in nothing else, which Simone considered a reasonable position and Dorothy considered a strategic manipulation by an individual who had figured out her grandmother before she was old enough to hold her own head up without assistance. The Barnes household had found its rhythm. It was the rhythm of a house with a baby and a working woman and an older woman who knew exactly how all of this was going to go because she had done her version of it. And it was not the rhythm anyone would have chosen under different circumstances, but it was a real rhythm and it held them. Simone worked from the kitchen table in the early morning and late evening when Amara slept. She had Maya, her project analyst, a 28-year-old woman who had found her through the Atlanta Black Business Council's Emerging Entrepreneur Network and who showed up via video call at 7 in the morning with specific questions and had already read everything Simone had sent her. Rochelle came in person twice a week, driving from Decatur to sit at Dorothy's kitchen table with a coffee from the shop on Lee Street and work through the communication strategy and the community partnership outreach. The Barnes Development Group was building, not fast, in the specific, deliberate way that things build when they are built right. Each step taken only after the previous one was solid. Each decision made with the understanding that this was not a vanity project or a post-divorce reinvention story or a small woman proving something to a large man. This was a real company, building a real project in a real neighborhood that had real people in it who deserved better than what had historically been offered to them. The Pittsburgh Neighborhood Project had moved from concept to early permit stage. Simone had partnered with a community development organization on the north side of the neighborhood, a group that had been doing resident engagement work for 12 years and knew every block and most of the families on it. She had spent 3 Saturdays at community meetings, listening more than speaking, understanding what the neighborhood actually needed versus what she had assumed it needed. What she found was both expected and specific. The residents wanted beauty. They wanted quality. They did not want to be displaced by their own neighborhood's improvement. They wanted local business. They wanted their children to be able to afford to live where they had grown up. They wanted to feel that the people building in their neighborhood saw them as the neighbors, not as the obstacle. She heard all of this and she took it back to her kitchen table and she rebuilt the project around it. The design changed. The community meeting space got larger. The retail units on the ground floor were restructured to prioritize local business owners at below market rates for the first 3 years. 2 of the 12 residential units were designated for residents who had been in the neighborhood for more than 15 years at rates that would not displace them. The project became something better than what she had originally designed. This was what happened when you listened. She had always known that. She had spent 11 years listening on Sterling's behalf, listening in rooms where he was not fully attending, listening and bringing back what she heard and translating it into strategic insight. She had been doing the listening labor of a marriage and a business partnership simultaneously and receiving credit for neither. Now the listening was hers and the strategy was hers and the project was hers. She thought, I was making myself smaller so he could feel larger in every room. I am done with that specific accommodation, done. The midpoint wisdom moment arrived on a Wednesday morning when she was walking back from the coffee shop on Lee Street. She had started going on Wednesday mornings when Dorothy kept Amara for an hour, a small personal ritual she had established because rituals matter. They anchor you. They say you are someone with a continuous life, not just a crisis, and she was thinking about the construction timeline. She stopped at the corner of Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard and Lee Street, and she looked at the neighborhood, at the houses, at the people, at the storefronts, at the sweet gum trees and the marigolds and the brick sidewalks that had been here for 100 years. She thought, I have been here before. Not just this neighborhood, though she had literally grown up 8 blocks from this corner. She had been at a beginning, an empty space where something she thought was permanent used to be. The last time she stood at a beginning like this, she was 21, and she built something that lasted 11 years. She was going to build something that lasted longer. She had spent 11 years making herself easier to be around so that Sterling could be the most important person in every room. She had made herself the quiet one so he could be the loud one. She had made herself smaller so someone else could feel large. She was done making herself smaller so someone else could feel large. She bought her coffee. She walked back to the house. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the project file. She got to work. The deposition of Sterling Marcus Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Whitfield Innovations, Limited Liability Company, was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in June. Simone wore the navy blazer she had bought when she was 29. She had had it since before Amara and it fit her changed body differently now, but it was hers and it was right and she did not replace it. She drove to Hartwell and Associates and took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked into the conference room. Sterling was already there, seated across from Crawford. Crawford was everything Sterling's money could buy: 60s, silver-haired, the practiced ease of a man who had been in these rooms so many times the furniture felt familiar. He nodded at Vivian when she entered. He did not nod at Simone. Sterling looked at her. She met his gaze. She held it. She let him look at the person she had become in the 8 months since she had left the penthouse, and she did not perform anything for him. She simply let him see her, and then she sat down. The deposition ran for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Crawford objected frequently. Vivian held her position on every objection that mattered. Sterling was composed and precise and had been prepared by the best, and it showed his answers were careful and specific and gave away as little as possible. Then Vivian put a document on the table. It was a strategic memo 8 years old. The header read, Market Entry Analysis, Whitfield Properties, Phase 1 Development. The text was in Simone's voice, the voice she used when she was writing for an internal audience, specific and analytical and direct. The recommendations were precise. The risk assessment was thorough. At the bottom of the front page, in Sterling's handwriting, reviewed and approved, S. Whitfield. The document was attributed in the header to SW 8 years ago. Sterling Whitfield had signed a document approving work product that bore both their initials, his and hers, and had presented it to investors as his own strategic analysis. He looked at the document. The shift in his composure was small, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a very slight stillness where there had been fluid ease. There and gone in less than 2 seconds, she saw it. She let it land. She did not react. I built more than he knows. He is looking at what I built, and he is beginning to understand what that means legally. And I am very quiet and very still. And this is mine, the deposition continued. At the end of it, Vivian gathered her materials with the unhurried precision of someone who had exactly what she needed and knew it. Crawford spoke briefly to Sterling in the hallway. They left. Simone and Vivian sat in the conference room after they were gone. The light was late afternoon light, warm and gold through the blinds. Amara was with Dorothy. The city moved outside the windows of the 14th floor. You were extraordinary in there, Vivian said. I was just honest, Simone said. In a room full of strategic dishonesty, Vivian said, honesty is extraordinary. Simone looked at her own hands on the table. The ring she had stopped wearing 4 months ago, the tan line it had left that had faded now to nothing. What happens next, she asked. Crawford calls me, Vivian said, within 48 hours, with a real number. He called in 36. Crawford did not call at a dramatic hour. He called on a Friday morning at 9:47, through official channels, a straightforward call to Vivian's direct line. Vivian called Simone immediately after. She said, come in. Today, if possible. Simone was at the Pittsburgh neighborhood site when the call came. She was standing in what would eventually be the community meeting room on the ground floor, looking at the exposed brick that the contractor had revealed behind the original drywall, and that she had immediately decided to keep because it told the truth about the building, about how old it was and what it had been before. She drove to Hartwell and Associates. The number Crawford had proposed was 37% of disclosed and undisclosed marital assets, as reconciled through the ongoing discovery process. A more serious child support commitment. Expanded visitation for Sterling. A non-disclosure agreement still, but with significantly narrowed scope. Better. Not good enough. He understands the exposure now, Vivian said. The deposition rattled them. The intellectual property documentation rattled them. Jade Prescott's removal from the registered agent positions rattled them. He is trying to close this before it gets any larger. What is our position, Simone said. Vivian spread her hands. Our position is that 31% equity in Whitfield Properties, specifically the portfolio you were most directly involved in building, plus a cash settlement that reflects the undisclosed transfers, plus primary custody with structured visitation, plus no non-disclosure agreement. That is our position. Simone looked at her. No non-disclosure agreement, she said. None, Vivian said. You built this case publicly, through 11 years of documented work. The settlement is not something you need to hide. And the minute you sign an NDA, you become the woman who took what she was offered and stayed quiet. You are not that woman. I was quiet for years. I am done being quiet. No NDA, Simone said. And it is equity, not cash. I want the piece of the property portfolio that I built, not money in exchange for it. Vivian nodded. That is the right ask. Equity is ongoing. Equity grows. Cash is a one-time payment. He built the tech company, Simone said. I helped, but it was his vision in that division. The property portfolio is different. I conceptualized the acquisition strategy for the first 4 properties. I drafted the community integration frameworks. I managed the renovation design process on 3 of them personally. That portfolio has my fingerprints on it in ways that the documentation proves. I want the equity stake in it. We will ask for 31%, Vivian said, and we will get it. The community reckoning had been unfolding in the background of all of this. It had been quiet and specific, the way real community reckonings often are, not dramatic, not public, but felt in the shifting of who calls whom and who sits with whom at what gathering and whose name gets said in which tone, in which context. At Greater Antioch, the women's ministry had its monthly Wednesday morning Bible study. Simone attended twice in those months, not every week, not as a regular but as a presence. She went when she could, and when she went, she was the same woman she had always been, which was a specific choice. She did not perform grief. She did not perform recovery. She showed up as herself each time and let that be its own statement. Mother Tatum made her statement at the October Fellowship Dinner's follow-up Bible study, when Sterling had attended the dinner alone, and several members had noted it, and the conversation had arrived at what people had seen and what it meant. Mother Tatum said, "That woman built his name as much as he built his money, and everybody in this room knows that. And I am not going to sit here and watch us act like we do not know that because he comes with a bigger check than she does." A pause. We do not get to speak about the strength of Black women and then leave one alone when she is postpartum and fighting for what she helped build. If we do that, we have said nothing true about anything. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Sister Patricia from the praise team said quietly, "Amen," and several other women separately said it after her. The community ledger shifted. Not all at once and not without complexity, there were people who stayed loyal to Sterling for their own reasons, business relationships, and personal history, and the particular reluctance of people who have known someone a long time to revise their understanding of that person. But the ledger shifted. The tide of perception moved slowly and permanently in Simone's direction. She did not campaign for it. She had not asked for it. She had not attended the Bible study to make a case for herself. She had attended because it was her church, and she was not going to be driven out of it. Mother Tatum had said what needed to be said. Simone thought about what that meant, about what it meant to have someone speak for you in a room you were not in, about the specific gift of an elder woman's voice, which carried in that community a weight that no personal statement could equal. Mother Tatum had been there for 52 years. Her word was not casual. Her word was architectural. The breathing room came on a Sunday afternoon in late October. Chantel came over with her 3 children, and the house on Ashby Street became what it was designed to be, full and loud in the specific way that only children of different ages can generate. A whole ecosystem of noise and need and love. Simone sat on the kitchen floor with Amara propped on a pillow between her legs, and Chantel's children arranged themselves around the baby in the configuration of small people who are extremely interested in someone smaller than themselves. Then Chantel's second child, Marcus, who was 6, and who had recently become very interested in testing the structural integrity of everything in the world, picked up a stuffed giraffe and placed it on Amara's head. Then he put a sock on top of the giraffe. Amara blinked. Then Amara, who had not laughed before, laughed. Not a small sound. A full, declarative laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that surprises the person making it as much as anyone hearing it. And Simone laughed. Real laughing. Full. From the belly, with her whole body, the kind that is not performed for anyone, the kind that closes your eyes and makes your shoulders shake. She laughed until her eyes watered. She knew objectively that a giraffe and a sock on a baby's head was not that funny. She laughed anyway. She laughed because the laughter had been waiting for this for a long time, and the giraffe and the sock had simply been the thing that opened the door. Chantel looked at her from across the kitchen. The smile that crossed Chantel's face was the specific smile that sisters share when one of them has come back from somewhere far away and you are watching her arrive. It was the smile of recognition, of relief, of, "There you are. I have been waiting for you." Simone caught the smile and held it. "I have not laughed, not really laughed, with my whole body in years. I said I was going to work on that. I did." The building was coming back. Not Sterling's building. Her building. The Barnes Development Group project in Pittsburgh. The community meeting space with the exposed brick. The 12 residential units above. The 4 commercial units below. The community announcement board that the partnership organization had already started populating with neighborhood notices even before the construction was complete. The thing she was building with her own hands and her own vision and her own documented understanding of what a neighborhood needed from the people who built in it. It was coming. She could feel it in the way it always felt when you were getting close to specific momentum of something that has been building in the right direction for long enough that it has become its own force. She was not close to done, but she was building. Sterling called on a Thursday evening in July, not through Crawford, not through any official channel. He called the number she had had since her junior year at Howard University, the number she had never blocked because she was too practical for that, because they shared a daughter, and she would need to be able to speak to him for the rest of her life. And that was simply the reality of the situation. He called it directly. She was in the kitchen at Dorothy's house. Amara was asleep. Dorothy was reading in the front room. The kitchen was quiet and lit warmly, and the evening was coming through the window, the long light of July in Atlanta laying itself across the floor in wide strips. She answered. "I want to talk," he said. "Not through the lawyers. I want to talk to you." She thought about whether to say yes. She thought about it for 1 second. "Then talk," she said. The silence that followed was not the silence of strategy. She had heard enough of Sterling's strategic silences in legal documents and through his attorney to know the difference. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of a man who had things he wanted to say, and did not know if the language he had used for most of his adult life was adequate to say them. Then he talked. He talked about the fear. The specific fear he had never named to anyone, maybe not even to himself until recently. The fear of being a first-generation billionaire in a country that was still deciding whether it believed in him. The way a country decides about black men with money in slow, grinding ways that are never quite finished. The fear that it could all be taken back, that the ground under the empire was never entirely solid, that what had been built against the odds could be dismantled against the odds with equal ease. The fear that had made him control everything he could control, and treat the things he loved as leverage points rather than gifts. He talked about Jade. He said it had started as a distraction from the fear, which was the most honest thing he had ever said about it. He said it had become a habit, and then a story he told himself, and then something he managed in the way he managed everything, by building a structure around it to contain the exposure. He said the structure had been a mistake that had compounded the original mistake until both mistakes had become the architecture of a deception he could no longer track without help. He talked about the money. He said for the first time, out in his own voice without attorneys or framing or strategy, the asset protection structure was marital protection, not business protection. He had built it to limit what she could claim if the marriage ended. He had built it while she was pregnant with their daughter. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Sterling, I believed in you before you had anything to believe in. I put my own career on hold for 7 years to support yours. I documented every contribution I made and never asked for credit because I thought that was what love looked like. I know now that I was wrong about that. And I know now that you knew I was making sacrifices and you let me make them, and you told yourself it was because I wanted to, because it was easier than having to give me what I deserved." He was quiet, she continued. "You told Jade I would walk away clean. You told her I was too dignified to fight. You were wrong about that. Dignity and fighting are not incompatible. I have been fighting with dignity for 8 months, and I intend to finish what I started." She paused. "Amara deserves a father," she said. "She is going to have one. You have shown up at every scheduled visitation. You have been present, that matters. But she is also going to grow up watching her mother, and she is going to see a woman who did not make herself small so someone else could feel large. Not for anyone, not even for the man who is her father." Another pause. "Have Crawford call Vivian with a real number," she said. "A real number. And do right by your daughter." She hung up. The seventh validation whisper arrived in the silence after the call. "I thought loving him was enough to protect us. I was wrong. And knowing I was wrong is not the same as having deserved it. I did not deserve it. I deserve better. My daughter deserved better. We are going to have better." She sat at the kitchen table. She thought about calling Chantel. She thought about calling Rochelle. She thought about calling her mother, who was 12 feet away in the front room. Instead, she got up and put the kettle on. She made a cup of tea. Dorothy's tea bags, the kind in the yellow box that had been in Dorothy's cabinet for 30 years. The kind that made chamomile taste like something warm and specific and real. She sat at the kitchen table and drank her tea. She thought about her grandmother, Eunice Barnes, who had died when Simone was 19, and who had been the person in her life she associated most with the particular quality of knowing exactly what was needed without being told and providing it. Eunice had been a woman who cooked by feel and prayed by instinct, and made spades look easy when she was cheating at it, which she apparently did regularly and excellently. She thought about something Eunice had said to her when she was 12. "You do not get to pick what happens to you. You only get to pick what you do next." She finished her tea, she rinsed the cup, she turned off the kitchen light, and she checked on Amara in the bassinet. Amara was asleep. Perfect. Serious even in sleep, that small face arranged in the concentration she brought to everything. Simone adjusted her blanket. She went to bed. Crawford called Vivian the next morning at 9:43. The number was real. The breathing room came that same evening. She had not planned it. She had been sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table, working through the response document Vivian had asked her to review, and at some point she had put her pen down and she had sat for a long time, and then she had gotten up without deciding to get up, and she had gone to the back porch, and she had sat in the chair, and she had stayed there until the stars were properly visible above the West End. The neighborhood at night in July. The sweet gum tree full of summer leaves. A warm smell of growing things and the distant smell of the city. Someone's music from down the block. Something slow and familiar that she could not quite make out. A dog asleep somewhere in a yard. The specific stillness of a summer night in Atlanta, which is not silence but something that contains sounds and is therefore different from silence. She sat. She thought about the real number Crawford had given Vivian. She thought about the equity stake. 31% of Whitfield Properties. The portfolio she had built with her own strategic mind and her own aesthetic sense and her own understanding of what a community needed from the people who built in it. Hers by right of contribution and documented labor and 11 years of invisible work that was about to become very visible indeed. She thought about Amara upstairs, about Dorothy in the front room, about Chantel who would be here Saturday, about Mother Tatum who had said you stood up while you were still standing, about Rochelle who had said I should have told you sooner and then had said I want to be your first hire, about Vivian who had said you kept a legal case, not just evidence, about all the people who had held her. She had not been alone. She breathed in the July night air and she let the neighborhood hold her in return. After a while, she went inside. She was ready for what came next. The mediation session was on the last Tuesday in July. It was held in the offices of a neutral mediator, the Honorable Winifred James, who was 62 years old and had been a family court judge for 19 years before she retired to mediation work. She ran her conference rooms with the same economy she had run her courtroom. No time wasted, no posturing permitted, every claim examined on its merits. Both parties were present. Both legal teams were present. The conference table was long and oval, and the light in the room was deliberately neutral, neither warm nor cold, the light of a place designed not to favor anyone. Simone sat on one side with Vivian. Sterling sat on the other side with Crawford. She looked at him. He looked at her. There were 8 months between the moment she had left the penthouse and this room. 8 months in which everything she had been was becoming had been in the process of becoming clear. She looked at him and she saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time, the way you can only see something clearly after you have stopped being inside it. He looked tired. She did not feel satisfaction at that. She felt something quieter than satisfaction. She felt the specific peace of someone who has done what needed to be done and is now at the point where the doing of it is almost complete. Judge James opened the session. The mediation was structured in alternating proposals. Crawford presented Sterling's position first. It was close to the number he had given Vivian on the phone. Close but not exactly. There were modifications to the equity percentage. Crawford proposed 28 instead of 31. There were modifications to the cash settlement. He proposed $11.4 million against Vivian's position of $14.2. There was still the non-disclosure agreement. Vivian presented Simone's position. She was methodical. She laid out the contribution matrix, first 11 years, project by project, documented contribution by documented contribution. She laid out the financial transfer evidence, $7.4 million, plus the trust structure that Darnell's information had revealed. She laid out Jade Prescott's sworn statement, which addressed the fraudulent misrepresentation that Sterling had made about the marital situation, and which had, his attorney knew well, significant legal implications for several of his defensive positions. Then she laid out the prenuptial fidelity clause. She read it aloud clearly in the neutral light of the mediation room. Crawford made one final objection. He said the fidelity clause required a specific evidentiary standard that the photograph, as a single piece of evidence, might not meet. Vivian set another document on the table: the hotel reservation, the expense reports, the text messages Jade Prescott had provided, the sworn statement, the phone records, the financial transfers timed to the beginning of the relationship. The fidelity clause specifies documented infidelity, Vivian said. We have documentation that spans 22 months and includes financial, legal, and witness evidence. The clause is met. Crawford was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Sterling and said something in a low voice. Sterling looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the mediation room. He looked at Simone. He said to Crawford, "Accept her terms." Crawford did not move immediately. He leaned towards Sterling again, speaking quietly. Sterling said louder, "Accept her terms, Reginald." Crawford sat back. Judge James noted the time. The settlement terms were 31% equity stake in Whitfield Properties. The specific portfolio that Simone had been most directly involved in developing the first 4 commercial acquisitions, the 3 residential renovations, the community integration framework she had built and documented over 5 years. Not cash in exchange for equity. Equity itself, ongoing and growing. $14.2 million in cash representing the undisclosed Delaware transfers and the trust structure assets, after legal fees and after the mediator's confirmation of the amounts. Primary physical custody of Amara. Joint legal custody. A structured visitation schedule that Simone and Sterling had negotiated directly and that did not require the mediator's intervention because they had both been, in this specific arena, reasonable. Full restoration of all credit and financial accounts to Simone Barnes as an individual. No non-disclosure agreement. Crawford had made one more attempt at the NDA. He had been clear about it, a limited scope, narrowly written, covering only the specific settlement terms, not the broader circumstances, not anything that would prevent Simone from speaking about the marriage or her professional contributions. Sterling looked at Crawford. Then he looked at Simone. Then he overruled his own attorney, he said. No NDA. Crawford did not argue. They signed. Judge James notarized the final documents. In the hallway outside the mediation room, while the attorneys were finalizing the paperwork copies, Simone walked toward the staircase. She always took the stairs. She had always found them clearer. Sterling was near the elevator. He said her name. She stopped. She looked at him. He said, "I am sorry. I know that does not change what happened. I know it is not enough. But I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. At the tired man who had built something real and had done something terrible to the person who had helped him build it. At the father of her daughter. At the man she had loved for 11 years who had not been who she had believed he was, but who had been real in other ways that she was going to have to hold with complexity for the rest of her life. She said, "Take care of your daughter, Sterling." She turned and walked to the staircase. The elevator doors opened behind her as she pushed through the staircase door. She heard, from behind her, through the closing door, the voice of Eugenia Whitfield. She let the staircase door close. She walked down 14 flights of stairs, and she breathed on every landing. When she came out of the building onto Peachtree Street, the August sun was full and direct, and she felt it on her face, and she did not brace against it. She stood on Peachtree Street in Atlanta in August, and she felt the sun on her face, and she breathed. She had spent 10 months bracing for what came next. What came next was hers. She had made it hers. The elevator behind her opened onto the lobby. Eugenia Whitfield crossed the lobby and came out through the glass doors and stopped when she saw Simone standing on the sidewalk. They looked at each other. Eugenia crossed the distance. She took both of Simone's hands in hers, both hands the way she held things that mattered. She said, "You did right, for yourself and for that baby, and I am proud of you. I am going to tell you that directly because I should have been more direct a long time ago." Simone squeezed her hands. "Thank you, Miss Eugenia." "She is going to be magnificent," Eugenia said. "My granddaughter. She is going to be magnificent because of who her mother is." Simone held her hands and she breathed the August air. And she thought of Amara in Dorothy's arms at home on Ashby Street, 10 months old, pulling the silk flower off Dorothy's hat because she had decided she needed that flower. And the decision was final. She thought, yes, she is going to be magnificent, and she is going to watch me be her mother. And that is going to mean something to her when she is old enough to understand what it took. My daughter will not grow up thinking a man's silence is safety. She will grow up watching her mother choose herself. And that is the best inheritance I can give her. That is the generational wealth that matters. I do not need to be rescued. I rescued myself. While 8 months pregnant and heartbroken and still keeping my word to myself and my daughter, that is what I did. And that is enough. The 8th validation whisper landed there, on Peachtree Street, in the August sun. She hugged Eugenia Whitfield. She got in the white Lexus. She drove home. It was the following September. Amara Whitfield was 10 months old. She had her father's cheekbones and her mother's eyes, and a laugh that sounded like bells and extremely clear opinions about which people in any given room were worth her attention. She had pulled herself to standing 3 weeks ago, holding onto the edge of Dorothy's coffee table with both hands and looking around the room with an expression of pure vindication, as though standing had been something she had always known was possible, and she had simply been waiting for her body to agree with her mind. The morning was warm and golden and specific in the way September mornings in Atlanta can be specific. The heat not yet gone, but the quality of the light changed, softer, at a different angle, carrying the first suggestion of what was coming even as it remained warm. Simone stood on the sidewalk in front of a building in the Pittsburgh neighborhood of Southwest Atlanta. The building had been renovated over 9 months. It was 4 stories brick with a wide ground floor that opened onto the street, and 4 commercial units that were already spoken for: a coffee shop owned by a family from the neighborhood, a bookstore run by a woman who had grown up 2 blocks away, a physical therapy practice, and a community organization that had been doing resident engagement work in Pittsburgh for 12 years and was moving its offices from a cramped rented space on another street. Above the commercial floor, 12 residential units. 12 families or individuals who would live in the Pittsburgh neighborhood in apartments that were, for the first time in this part of Atlanta, both beautiful and affordable. Units that had been designed with the specific aesthetic values of the community. They were built in the exposed brick, the high ceiling, the wide windows, the built-in community bulletin boards and gathering spaces. On the first floor, off the commercial hallway, a community meeting space, free to neighborhood organizations by reservation. 300 square feet of good light and stackable chairs, and a small kitchen and the exposed brick that she had decided to keep the first time she had seen it. Above the door of the building, in clean letters that were legible from the street, Barnes Development Group. Her name. First, today was the ribbon cutting. Dorothy Barnes was there. She was wearing the church hat. The good one, with the brim and the silk flower in plum and gold, the one that came out only for events of genuine significance. She was holding Amara, who was extremely interested in the silk flower and had been making a persistent case for possessing it since they had arrived. Chantel was there with her 3 children, all of whom were dressed in their Sunday clothes, because Chantel had told them this was an important occasion, and their grandmother would be there in the church hat, and that was how they knew. Chantel had been crying since they parked. She was explaining it as allergies. No one was accepting this explanation. Rochelle Dupree was there in her professional capacity, having coordinated the press outreach and the community notification and the social media presence and the physical signage and approximately 17 other things that had required her particular expertise. She was also there in her personal capacity, as the woman who had driven from Decatur twice a week for 9 months to sit at a kitchen table and build something alongside the person she should have been building with 10 years ago. Vivian Hartwell was there because Simone had called her personally and said, "I want you to be at the ribbon cutting." Vivian had said, "I will be there." She was there in a suit the color of deep water, and she had brought a small crystal vase with a single stem inside it, and she had handed it to Simone without explanation because it did not need one. Reverend Isaiah Caldwell was there. He had been asked to offer a blessing over the building, and he was prepared to do it with the specific warmth of a man who had gotten some things wrong and was working steadily and with humility to be better. He had reached out to Simone in March to say so directly. She had appreciated the directness. Mother Frances Tatum was there. She had driven herself. She was 74 years old and she still drove, and she would like the record to reflect that. She was wearing her church best, which meant she had come from somewhere holy before she came here. She was carrying her Bible, which she carried everywhere, and which had been carried so many miles that the spine was soft from handling, and the corners of the pages had begun to curl inward from use. Jade Prescott was not there. She had her own life and her own process and her own mourning. She had texted Simone a week before, "Congratulations, I hope it is everything you built it to be." Simone had texted back one word, "Thank you." That was sufficient. That was what was needed and nothing more. Sterling Whitfield was not there. He was at the park with Amara on alternating Sundays. He had kept every scheduled visit. He was learning, in the specific and ongoing way that people learn things that require them to revise who they thought they were, how to be a father in the circumstances that actually existed rather than the ones he would have preferred. He was not finished learning. He might not finish, but he was doing the work. Reverend Caldwell spoke a brief blessing over the building. He called it a good work and a right work and a work that had been built by a woman who understood that the people who lived in a neighborhood were not obstacles to its beauty but were its beauty, and that this building was going to prove that for years. "Amen," said Mother Tatum. "Amen," said everyone else. The ribbon was cut. Dorothy cried. Chantel cried loudly, no longer attributing it to allergies, accepting the situation. Amara, from Dorothy's arms, reached out and grabbed the silk flower from Dorothy's hat. She had wanted it all morning. She got it. She held it up and looked at it with the full concentration of a person who has finally obtained something she knew was rightfully hers. Simone laughed. The full laugh. The real one. From the belly. With her whole body. The one that was not performed for anyone. The one that closed her eyes and made her shoulders shake. She laughed at her daughter's expression of vindication, at the silk flower held aloft like a trophy, At Chantel's face, at Dorothy saying, Amara Ann Whitfield, that hat cost $37, which was a number Dorothy had mentioned in regard to this hat on approximately 12 previous occasions. She laughed and the September air was warm around her, and the building stood behind her, solid and brick and real and hers. The breathing room filled the hour that followed, people moving through the new space. Dorothy making a circle of the community meeting room, touching the exposed brick with one hand, nodding at it the way she nodded at things that were right. Chantel's children investigating everything that could possibly be investigated. Rochelle talking to the press contact from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who had shown up, a woman who had been covering Atlanta development for 7 years and had called the Barnes Development Group story one of the most interesting she had encountered this year. Simone moved through the space. She touched the exposed brick. She stood in the community meeting room and breathed the smell of new construction and old brick together, the specific smell of something made, something built from something that had existed before it. She looked out the wide windows at the Pittsburgh neighborhood street, at the houses and the trees and the people going by on a September Saturday morning. She thought about what she had wanted when she was 21. She had wanted to build something that mattered. She had wanted to build it for herself. She had built it. It was not the only thing she was going to build. She could feel the next one already forming somewhere below thought, the way things form before they have names. But this one was complete. This one was here. This one had her name above the door. Mother Tatum found her in the community meeting room during a quiet moment between the ceremony and the reception that Rochelle had organized in the coffee shop unit, which was open for the first time today, with the family from the neighborhood behind the counter doing what they had spent a month preparing to do. Mother Tatum looked around the space. The brick, the light. The announcement board, already covered with neighborhood notices that the Community Partnership Organization had been pinning up since 8 in the morning before anyone else arrived. She nodded. The particular nod she used when something was right. She said, "Your grandmother would want me to tell you something." Simone said, "What?" Mother Tatum said, "She would want me to tell you she saw this coming. Not this specifically, but she knew you were made for something that was yours. She told me that once. She said, that girl of Dorothy's, she is going to build something real. Keep your eye on her." Simone could not speak for a moment. Then she said, "You knew my grandmother?" Mother Tatum smiled. It was a smile of genuine warmth and genuine amusement, both together, baby, she said. "I was at her kitchen table every Tuesday afternoon for 12 years. We played spades. She cheated. She was very good at it." Simone laughed. The full laugh again from the belly with her whole body. The laugh that had been coming back for months now, returning a little more of itself each time, reclaiming the space it had given up during the years she had not laughed really. She laughed and Mother Tatum patted her hand. "Go see your daughter," Mother Tatum said. "She has been trying to put that flower on the coffee shop counter for 10 minutes, and your sister is running out of reasons to stop her." Simone went. Dorothy was standing near the door with Amara on her hip, the silk flower now secured in Amara's fist, with the grip of someone who had no intention of giving it back. Amara looked at her mother when she approached. She looked at her with those dark eyes, her father's cheekbones and her mother's eyes, the small person who had arrived in the middle of the hardest year of her mother's life and had somehow been the clearest possible reason for every hard thing that had been done in it. Simone held out her hands. Amara leaned toward her. The transfer from grandmother to mother, from one set of arms to another, accomplished with the ease of a baby who knew both places equally well and was at home in either. Simone held her daughter. She stood in the doorway of the building with her name above it, and she held her daughter, and she looked out at the Pittsburgh neighborhood street and the September sun and the building that was real and the people who had helped make it real, and the ones who had held her when she could not hold everything herself. She thought about her grandmother Eunice, about the spades games and the Tuesday afternoons, and the woman who had said, "You do not get to pick what happens to you, you only get to pick what you do next." She thought about Dorothy, who had stepped aside that first evening and let her in without asking a single question. She thought about Chantel, who had known before she did and had waited for her to be ready. She thought about Rochelle, who had been holding evidence for 14 months and had finally let it go. She thought about Vivian, who had said you have a legal case, not just documentation. She thought about Darnell, who had called from a number she did not recognize and told the truth because his conscience had finally outweighed his loyalty to silence. She thought about Mother Tatum, who had held her hands in a vestibule and said you stood up while you were still standing. She thought about the woman she had been at 21, bright and certain and not yet careful, writing in purple ink, "I want to build something that matters." She had built something that mattered. The final wisdom arrived there, in the doorway, with her daughter in her arms and September light around her, and the neighborhood going about its Saturday morning in the way that neighborhoods go about their business, continuous and alive. Her grandmother used to say that black women do not start from scratch. We start from experience. Every time, she finally understood what that meant. She had not lost 11 years. She had built 11 years of knowledge about business and about law and about herself and about what she would not accept and what she was worth and what she could build and how she could build it, that no man and no court and no settlement negotiation could take out of her body. She had been starting from everything. She had been starting from all of it. And everything she had lived through had been the experience she was starting from today. She stepped out the door and into the September sun. Amara held the silk flower up toward the sky. It caught the light plum and gold and moved in the small morning wind. Simone adjusted Amara on her hip. She walked out onto the Pittsburgh neighborhood sidewalk. Her neighborhood, the one she had grown up near and come back to and built in, and she began to move through the morning. I was quiet for years. I am done being quiet. And what I built in the silence, what I built while no one was watching, what I built while I was invisible, what I built when I was still someone's wife, and no one thought to ask what else I was, that is mine, all of it. It has always been mine. The ninth validation whisper arrived there, on the sidewalk. This is not the end of my story. This is the end of his chapter in it. My chapter is just beginning, and it is mine. It is completely mine. The final validation whisper. She thought it. She said it under her breath. She held it. Then she walked. The sound around her was the sound of the neighborhood, a car going by, someone's music from an upstairs window, a child calling to another child somewhere down the block, the specific and irreplaceable sound of a Saturday morning in southwest Atlanta in September, when the summer is almost gone and the air smells of something new beginning. And underneath all of it, specific and real in hers, the sound of her own footsteps on the sidewalk. Her sidewalk, her neighborhood, her morning, her life. She walked forward into all of it. Whatever came next, she was more than ready.